And we are the Coalition, loud and proud, outrage porn-free, civilly disobedient media, broadcasting live on the Worldwide Coalition Network here at the Go Local Live Broadcast Center, deep in the heart of the city we love, Providence, Rhode Island. Facebook.com/The Coalition Radio. On the mighty Twitter at Coalition_radio. And of course the mothership at coalitionradio.us. My name is Pat Ford. I'm your host for this evening. If it's the first time you're seeing our show, we break it into roughly 3 1-hour or so segments, commercial free. We've got a wonderful group of sponsors who allow this to happen. And we cover the subjects that I like to think of as the third rails of American politics. All the challenging stuff. Healthcare, sexuality, crony corporatism, the culture wars. But we do it so in a respectful, conversational format. Again, we are outrage porn free. Before we get to our first set of guests, and I'm going to do something a little unusual tonight in terms of the format, because I'm effectively going to turn the mic over to them, the camera over to them for an hour or so. A couple of editorial comments. Last week, we were blessed to have on the air, via the miracle of Skype, a young woman who's become a noted community activist in, talk about third rails, in the area of vaccination. Now, interesting, my experience has been with the folks who've been on this show that typically their areas of concern, their areas of, let's call it opposition to legislation, has a lot to do, more to do with informed consent, has a lot more to do with parental rights, has a lot more to do with government roles in vaccination as opposed to the vaccinations themselves. Now, simultaneously, they raise legitimate concerns about the efficacy and the manner in which, let's just say, vaccines are tested, researched, and, if you will, and I'll use the air quotes, marketed. First off, I come from a generation where polio was, well, at its end. A vaccine to prevent polio had been introduced to the market. But growing up, I knew young people who had polio and carried the scars of it for the rest of their lives. On the other hand, I support and celebrate the roles of the individuals who are willing to study, to work, and ethically, intelligently, in an articulate and cogent manner, challenge the status quo. And that status quo can be anything. The role of government in a market or in our culture, medical industries, legal industries, once considered sacrosanct. But as this generation has become more cynical, we understand that those industries are filled with plenty of well-meaning people, but very often the results, the outcomes can move far away from their quote-unquote intended public goal. As a result, for those people willing to invest the time, I will always give them the airways. They don't have to have PhDs. They don't have to have had experience working for some governmental organization. Quite frankly, they're very often a breath of fresh air. I don't bring on the show conspiracy theorists. I don't bring on the show folks who are irrational or won't support their claims or won't document their studies. This nation was founded by a group of farmers and self-made scholars. The notion that we have to have a PhD or some type of certification or some type of granted validity by some outer body is ridiculous. We've got a government filled with lawyers, accountants, and experts, and things aren't going so well right now. And we must always remember the citizens' role, the stakeholders' role, that's the new millennial term, the stakeholders' role, as the ones who pay for it and the ones who have to ultimately live with the consequences. So those people are always welcome on my show, regardless of the area of topic, the area of consideration, the issues. Folks who are willing to have a conversation as opposed to the circular logic, the echo chambers that exist in social media today. Secondly, briefly, we were not so astonished to find out, last week we had Victor Matheson on, so we knew this was coming, that again the city of Pawtucket is going to engage, talk about circular logic and a circular firing squad, and yet another attempt to, in the words of the great Bart Simpson, monorail, monorail, monorail. Yes, they've found another silver bullet. If you're a little older, you knew that a boy needs a band, 76 trombones. What I'm pointing out to is what we've got again is a private investment / tax shelter masquerading as economic development for a select group of individuals who've chosen to pursue what is clearly a willing victim of economic racism, that is the city of Pawtucket. So we're going to build a state-of-the-art facility. Ever notice how it's always state-of-the-art? We're going to build soccer stadium, even though a Major League Soccer team less than 20 miles away can't grow attendance. We're going to build retail, even though the malls around us are crapping out. And quite frankly, I don't remember the last time I bought anything in a store. I'm embarrassed to admit. We're going to build apartments. Well, one of the problems in Rhode Island is that we subsidize the creation of luxury apartments. Therefore, we shouldn't be shocked when there's a paucity of middle income and affordable housing in the state, should we? So again, the fraudsters are upon us. They see the willing victim, the willing host. We're going to do everything we can to present the people of Rhode Island with reasoned discourse on what I think is even a bigger ripoff coming around the bend right at you. And the worst part, the laws enabling this legislation were passed just days after Rhode Islanders had clearly evoked a disgust with the notion of taxpayer money being used to support, prop up, subsidize private business, often businesses that were in competition with Rhode Island businesses themselves. Again, we have a situation in the state where the burghers, the wise men on the hill would tell us that it's okay to use the coercive power of government to take money away from people to literally subsidize their own, well, competition. And what's the coalition word for that? Balderdash. Let's get right to it. We've got some phenomenal people going to join us tonight. Waiting in the wings, I'm going to take the unusual step of turning over the audience, if you will, the chamber here, to a pair of doctors, Dr. James Cowan and Dr. John Mark Ryan. Interestingly enough, physicians who are ready to promote to you the notion of single-payer health insurance. They come from the finest medical schools on the planet, high-level, I should say, corporate experience in terms of Aetna and a variety of healthcare services, as well as working right here in Rhode Island Hospital. I'm using this format this way because I want folks to give the folks the opportunity to make a presentation. In the coming weeks, we're going to have folks in who do not like the idea of single-payer health care. And then what I hope to promote is sometime during January, a conversation between groups where it's actually a conversation where we discuss facts, not rhetoric, where we discuss issues, not emotions, and maybe get at least insight into what is clearly the most challenging economic issue of our time, and that is healthcare. So, as they say, without further ado, I'm going to bring in Drs. Cowan and Drs. Ryan. I'm going to turn that over to them for about an hour or so, and they're going to make a little presentation. I hope, it is my concerted hope that whether you watch this tonight, or whether you listen to it in the near future via podcast or Facebook Live or YouTube, that you will remove yourself, in all cases, from your personal belief system and step back to a simpler time where we simply listen to other people's ideas, thought about them, processed them, had our own internal debate, talked about it amongst our friends, and then came back with a salient, either an argument or support of it. Because ultimately, the theme for tonight seems to be, and it always kind of happens on the fly, that if we simply wall ourselves off into our own little private Idaho, we will never break free of the morass that the culture wars have brought us where we find ourselves today. And that, as they say, would be a shame. So, let me turn over the mic, and I want to thank them for coming in. Again, it's the holidays, so folks who are willing to take time on a Friday night to have a little chat, outstanding.
So I'm Dr. Jim Cowan.
I'm Dr. Mark Ryan. I'd like to thank Pat Ford for having us on his show and giving us this opportunity to talk about health insurance reform, single-payer healthcare, Medicare for all. It's an issue which he's already said is of vital importance to the nation. It consumes a huge amount of our nation's wealth, and it, of course, affects every individual living in this country. So what is Medicare for all? What is single-payer? All that's being proposed here is not how healthcare is delivered, it's only about how healthcare is funded. Currently, you have the people of the country, the people who actually consume healthcare, who need healthcare, paying a multitude of financial institutions, insurance companies, middlemen as it were, a certain amount of money. And in return, hopefully, the care that they need is paid for. On the other side, receiving the payments are doctors, nurses, pharmacists, hospitals, clinics, things like that, where people go to get the care that they need. The only thing that we're changing about this entire arrangement is that middle part. Instead of having a multitude of private insurance companies, we just expand one insurance company that's already there, has been in existence for over almost 40 years, and has been doing a great job, and that's called Medicare. So the doctors and hospitals are continue to be privately owned, privately self-employed, and the people who need to go and see them continue to do so without interruption. But what changes is payment. Canada, our neighbor to the north, has done this in 1972. Since then, they have had to make no real major overhauls of how they fund their health care, and yet in that time, the United States has had at least 4 or 5 different attempts, all of which have not done very well, and of which, as obviously, since we're still talking about the need for reform, have not succeeded. So I'd like to ask Dr. Cowan to explain to us, why is it that we've come to this point? Why is it that all of these attempts at reform that we've undertaken over the last 40 years have not worked?
Well, thank you, Mark. The fundamental problem with the current system that Mark's described, with multiple insurance companies competing for business, is that the insurance industry is actually not fit for purpose. And the evidence for that is, one, historical, that we've been struggling with this problem for over 70 years, and we still have a healthcare system that's fueled by payments that have failed to control the cost of healthcare and have failed to provide access today to 30 million Americans. And the cost of healthcare is roughly twice in the US what it is in other developed countries in the world. So we're facing a problem which tinkering around the edges is not going to solve. And that's why a radical change like single-payer Medicare for all as the basis of our health insurance system in the United States is actually the only solution that will work. And here's why it's the only solution. Health insurance is fundamentally different from other kinds of insurance. You can insure your house, for example. You just go down the street to the insurance agent and you buy a policy and you go home and it's all over and done with. And you can do the same with your car. And the reason you can do that, let's take the example of insuring your house. If your house costs $100,000 and 1 in 1,000 houses like yours burn down every year, then the insurance business is very simple. You get 1,000 people who want to insure their house, their $100,000 house. And if the house burns down 1 time out of 1,000 every year, you charge each of them $100. And $100 times 1,000 people is $100,000. And with that, you can pay for the house that burnt down for one of those people. That's how insurance works. And what it requires is that you know the cost of replacing whatever the thing is that you're insuring. Same with a car or a boat or even a life insurance policy. You know what's going to be paid out if someone dies. But if I ask anyone, what is the cost of your health care next year, they can't answer that question. And that's a big problem, because if you don't know the cost of the thing that you're insuring when you come to replace it, then actually it's uninsurable. That's a basic fact about insurance. And what this means is that the health of an individual person is actually not insurable. And as a result of that, the individual health insurance market, where people attempt, like Senator Ted Cruz said in 2016, that you should be able to go out and buy the health insurance that you want, what they find is that they can't buy what they want partly because they don't know what they want, because nobody knows what their health costs are going to be next year. But if you come to me with, say, 1 million people and say, hey, Jim, I'd like to insure the health of these 1 million people here that live in the state of Rhode Island or that work for my company or something like that, then I'd be very happy to insure 1 million people, because although I don't know who's going to get sick, I do know what proportion of those people will have a heart attack next year, how many women will have a baby, how many of those babies will be high-risk babies in the neonatal intensive care unit, and so on. So you can, with a large number of people, you can estimate their healthcare costs very accurately based upon their age and gender and how much their healthcare costs in the previous year. So you can insure people in groups. And that's the situation that we have today for people who are not trying to buy health insurance on their own. They're in a group of some kind, either through their employer, they have Medicare, Medicaid, they're in the VA system, and so on. But there are problems with this, because at this point you might say, well, okay, why isn't this working then? And the reason it's not working is because when you have multiple groups, multiple insurance companies competing against one another, then you get something called adverse selection. An adverse selection is demonstrated by insurance companies adversely selecting against patients by trying to not insure people who are sick or encourage people who are sick that they have insured to go and join another company. And what that does is it reduces the amount of money that an insurance company has to pay out if they don't insure sick people, and the company is more profitable, but the sick people have a problem finding insurance and other companies have a problem staying in business. And that's what we see in the health insurance market today. It requires government intervention to maintain the stability of it because it's inherently unstable. Patients also adversely select against insurance companies because they will not buy insurance, health insurance, if they think that they're healthy and are not going to get sick. And of course, then some of them do. And in the end, the taxpayer picks up the tab for those people. So that kind of adverse selection by patients is actually an interesting situation when compared with property and casualty insurance. Because if you insure your house, knowing that you need to get some cash quickly, so you go down to the insurance agent and you insure your house, and the next day you burn down your house and you try to collect the insurance money, then you'll find that you're in big trouble because you've committed insurance fraud, and you will actually go to jail for a specific insurance fraud, which is called arson. But if you, being healthy, don't buy health insurance, and then you get some aches and pains, maybe you lose a little weight, feel tired, and you think, maybe I'm sick and maybe there's something seriously wrong with me, then at that point you go out and you buy health insurance, and you go and see the doctor, and yes, you are sick and you face a lot of medical bills in the future, then that is quite legal, and you might even argue that that is actually a sensible thing to do in the system that we have, which is to wait until you get sick and then buy health insurance and then go and see the doctor. So these are two reasons why the health insurance market as we have it today is not fit for purpose. It doesn't provide coverage for everybody because some people can't afford to buy health insurance because of the competition between insurers and their unwillingness to insure sick people, and because of the behavior of people who choose not to buy health insurance when they really could. And both of these things drive up the cost of health insurance for everybody and make it difficult for people who need it most, which is people who are sick, to actually get it. Let me stop at that point, Mark, and see if you have anything to add to what I've been saying.
No, I think that covers it pretty well. So I think the next thing we usually talk about is, so we have established, we hope, that there are fundamental flaws in the way health insurance is structured. Regular insurance is structured to protect you against an event that is unlikely to occur. You do not anticipate your house will burn down. You don't anticipate your car is going to get into a wreck. And you buy insurance to protect against the unlikely event that those things happen. But with health insurance, it's almost like buying groceries. It's something that you know you will use in the coming year and it will need to be paid for. Unlike groceries, you could be stuck with a $100,000 grocery bill if it's healthcare we're talking about. Unlikely to happen at the supermarket. So there are some components of this that are protecting against sudden catastrophic cost. But in general, healthcare, particularly health maintenance, which Jim and I were doing, I'm a practicing internist and Jim was. This is something that we anticipate people are going to get on a regular basis. So it really, health insurance doesn't work like other kinds of insurance, which is another reason why it doesn't work very well. So what are the consequences of allowing this system to persist? As I mentioned earlier, we've made a number of attempts at reforming it, and yet somehow we're in the situation that we're at. Well, there are very bad consequences to the system that we have. First of all, and the worst, is death. We now have 30 million uninsured. We had, prior to the onset of the enactment of Obamacare, or the Affordable Care Act, we had 50 million American uninsured. Conservative estimates are that of those 50 million people, 1 of 1,000 this coming year would die due to the fact that they have inadequate insurance. So prior to Obamacare being enacted, 50,000 Americans died annually for lack of insurance. That's almost the number of Americans who died during the entire Vietnam War. And yet we were allowing that to happen year after year after year. Now that we have 30 million uninsured, we have 30,000 people who are going to die this coming year because they have no insurance, which is clearly unacceptable. In any other setting, this would be called an epidemic. You'd be having congressional hearings. There would be all sorts of things going on to try to remedy this situation. So we have death as a result of uninsurance and underinsurance. Why do people die? For the obvious reason, they can't afford the care. They know they can't, and they delay getting care. I know personally that I've had patients who've had chest pain, were not sure that their insurance would cover a hospital visit, and at least one man sat on the end of his bed for 12 hours with his chest pain. He called me the following morning. By that time, he had already had a fairly massive heart attack, and he was dead of congestive heart failure 3 years later, all of which was preventable had he gone at the onset of the chest pain. I'm just one doctor, and I know several cases. Multiply this by the number of doctors nationwide. That's a lot of people to whom this is happening. So death. Why are these people delaying care? For the second reason, that our healthcare system is not doing its job, and that's bankruptcy. Several studies have been done over the last 10 years showing that up to 60% of people who declare personal bankruptcy do so because of health insurance, healthcare costs. And of the people who declared bankruptcy because of their healthcare costs, 75% of them had insurance at the onset of the illness or injury that bankrupted them. Why did they go bankrupt? Because, again, a lot of the insurance in this country is tied to employment. If you become critically ill, if you're severely injured, frequently you lose your job. There's a program, COBRA, that carries you over for a while, but it doesn't last forever. After that, you're on your own. You're uninsured, and again, you lose your money, you lose your house, you become bankrupt. The third thing about our healthcare system that doesn't work very well is the expense to the country. As Jim already mentioned, we, as a country, pump twice as much money into our healthcare system as any other developed country on earth. More than twice the amount that Canada does. And yet in Canada, everyone is covered and no one goes bankrupt because of healthcare costs. So we have a system that is lethal, that bankrupts people, and is unaffordable to the country as a whole. In 2016, the House of Representatives passed a bill variously described as the American Health Care Act or Trump Care, which then the Senate was going to have to take up and decide how they were going to act on it. I remember watching a television program, Fox and Friends, where they actually discussed this. Most of the analysts were concentrating on the political aspect of it, but one of the panelists, Charles Krauthammer, who actually had been a practicing psychiatrist before moving full-time into becoming a political commentator, actually got up and said, because of Obamacare, most Americans now feel that they ought to have access to health care when they need it. The Senate will have two choices, to either go back to an economic model where your income decides whether or not you get care, or the Senate or the Congress will be forced to go to a federally funded model. And this was the shocking part. He said, I predict that within 7 years, we will be in a single payer, nationally funded national health insurance program. A fairly shocking thing to be said on Fox News. Why did he say it? Well, Krauthammer was a physician and he was looking at data. And the data he was obviously looking at was the Congressional Budget Office, the analysis of how healthcare costs have risen over the last 40 years. Healthcare and premium, health insurance premiums have risen at approximately 5% per year since 1970, during which time the average rate of inflation was 2 to 2.5%, and the rise in the average wage about the same number, 2 to 2.5%. By 2025, that 7-year mark that Krauthammer was talking about, the cost of the average health insurance policy by CBO estimates will equal 50% of the average person's wage. And by some estimates, by 2032, it will equal 100% of the average person's wage. This is clearly unsustainable. Krauthammer knew that. What are the results? Well, we're already seeing the beginnings of it. Although the Affordable Care Act has been fully implemented, in the last 2 years, 3 million more Americans have lost their health insurance because one thing that the ACA, Obamacare, does not do is control the rise in health insurance premiums and the rise in healthcare costs. It is unable to do so because it leaves intact a fragmented payment system made of multiple insurance companies, including the largest ones, Medicare and Medicaid, and yet costs are not being reined in. So we have a system that's lethal, a system that bankrupts, a system that cannot control costs. So a question then is, why can't this system control the costs? Why is it that we are unable to do what Canada does, what Europe does, what Japan does, what Australia does, and keep our healthcare costs under control? And I think the way we pay for our healthcare is one of those reasons. So I'll let Jim sort of analyze, break that down as to why it is we're having such a problem keeping our costs under control.
Well, thanks, Mark. The way to think about this is from a capitalist point of view, and in the sense that you want an efficient market if you're going to have economic transactions, which is what we're talking about here. People need healthcare, has to be paid for, and there's economic transactions involved there. So you need an efficient market where those transactions can take place. And we don't have that with the health insurance industry. Part of the reason for that, which Mark was speaking to, is the fact that the payment to an individual doctor or to a hospital, for example, comes from many different sources. About 50% of the payment to most hospitals and most doctors comes from Medicare, a government program. Another 20% comes from Medicaid, another government program. And the remaining 30% is split between various government agencies and private insurance companies. Typically that 30%, maybe the Blues would control 15% of those payments, and other companies would control a smaller portion of it. So none of this is surprising or is anything, it's not a problem, except for the fact that the government entities are not allowed to negotiate prices with doctors and hospitals by Congress, by statute, from the way that the programs are set up, including the Affordable Care Act. And as a result of that, the negotiating for prices of health services in healthcare, whether it's drugs, hospital services, medical devices like pacemakers, or services that doctors and other healthcare professionals provide, or the negotiation for the prices of all of those services is done by the 30% or less of the market that actually is allowed to negotiate prices. And that 30% is fragmented between the Blues and other companies. So even the Blues control only about 1/6 of the revenue and the spend in any particular healthcare market. So the people who can negotiate have very, very weak negotiating position. And the government programs then set their prices based on whatever these private companies have been able to negotiate. So you have a system in what is presented as a competitive capitalist marketplace for health insurance. What you really have is a marketplace which is grossly inefficient because there is no entity in that marketplace that has the leverage to actually negotiate prices and manage costs effectively. And that, in a nutshell, that is why healthcare costs in the United States are roughly twice that of other similar developed countries, even though we have a less healthy population that Mark will speak to in a few minutes. Let me give you an example of what this looks like in practice. I was at one time involved in a discussion between a health insurer and a large health system in another state. And the purpose of the meeting was to look for savings that could be found in the way that healthcare people were spending their money on healthcare. And on one side of the table were representatives of the large health system, including the chief medical officer and the chief financial officer. And on the side of the table where I was sitting were the insurance people who were working in that market. And I was at the end of the table, and the meeting began, and the business leader for the insurance company looked down the table and said, well, hey Jim, what have you got for us today? Because I was the data guy that was supposed to, or did come up with savings opportunities. So I said, well, what we have today, the best opportunity we have is that in this health system, last year, there were 1,000 MRI scans were done, and the contracted rate for paying for those scans was $1,200 per scan. So we're spending $1.2 million on MRI scans. But down the street from the hospital, there's a freestanding radiology center with an MRI scanner that's not part of the health system, and the contracted rate there is only $400. So if you're able to send, and I'm looking at the hospital representatives now, if you're able to send your MRI patients down the street, we'll save $800 per scan, or $800,000 in the course of a year. And the chief financial officer of the health system folds his arms and sort of leans across the table and looks me right in the eye, and he says, Jim, we're not going to do that. And the business people on my side of the table said, okay, Jim, what's next? Now, think about this. We've just had an opportunity for $800,000 worth of savings, and there will be similar savings in other areas of healthcare too, in that community. And that opportunity has been left on the table and nobody's picked it up. So you might ask the question, well, what's wrong with this situation? There must be somebody in the room who's wearing the black hat and is an evil person. I don't think that it's the chief financial officer of the health system, because his job is to make sure that his organization, which is chartered by the state, it was a not-for-profit system, chartered by the state to provide health care to that community, which was mainly rural community, and they were the only show in town. So his job, if he's going to discharge or help his organization discharge its responsibility, his job is to meet his payroll every 2 weeks, and at the end of the year have some money left over that he can use for capital improvements. And if he does that, the health system will thrive, and the people in the community that do have health insurance will be able to go and get health care. And his board will be pleased, and he'll probably get congratulated and maybe a bonus. So he's actually doing his job. He's doing the job that he's been handed. So in the sense of what he's being asked to do by society, he's wearing a white hat. On the other side of the table, on the health insurance side of the table, then when I worked for a health insurance company, then on the company intranet, when you opened up your computer in the morning, you saw the home page, the splash page of the company intranet, and in the top right-hand corner, there was the company's stock price, along with that of its competitors. And that stock price was updated every few minutes throughout the day. So every time you went to that home page of the intranet, then you'd see the stock price. So that reinforced a message that was sent throughout the company, which was that whatever you're doing each day, you should have a line of sight to this stock price. And that's appropriate behavior for a for-profit publicly traded company. There's nothing wrong with that. That's the way that a capitalist society works and the way that incorporated companies work. But the impact of that is that if the company is paying $1,200 for an MRI scan when its patients have a scan, then they need to charge a premium which will cover that MRI scan. So let's say we're insuring nothing but MRI scans. And let's say that the premium revenue that the company gets for MRI scans is some way proportional to $1,200. If the company contracts with an entity that's providing MRI scans for $400, then if it's going to capitalize on that by getting more business because it has a lower premium, the premium now has to be set for a $400 scan rather than a $1,200 scan. So in simple terms, the premium would be only 1/3 as much. Then to capitalize on the savings, the company has to lower its premium. And an insurance company's revenue is mainly derived from premiums. So the company's revenue is going to decrease between whatever premiums needed for a $1,200 scan down to the premium that will be for a $400 scan. So last year, we were getting $1,200 scans, premium revenue's up here, and then all of a sudden the premium revenue is lower because we've got these scans at a lower price. What happens to the stock price of the company if its revenue goes down? Well, the stock price will go down because the stock price is driven in any publicly traded company mainly by revenue, top-line revenue, and by the prospects for growth of that revenue. So if your top-line revenue goes down, you lose on both counts. You've got less revenue, and rather than growth, you've got actually a shrinkage of your revenue. So the role of people working for a for-profit private health insurer is fundamentally to manage and improve the company's stock price. And if they actually succeed in negotiating a lower cost for care, then their premium revenue will go down and their stock price will go down. So the people on the health insurance business side of the table where I was sitting, they're not wearing a black hat either. These are not evil, wicked insurance people. These are people that umpire Little League games and go to church on Sunday morning and so on. And they're doing the job that they've been handed, which is to maximize shareholder value. The problem is that the system that they're working in, both the CFO of the hospital and the business leadership in a private health insurance company, are given tasks which, when performed expertly and really well, lead to two things. One is an inability to control healthcare costs, and the second is a failure to actually provide health insurance to everyone who lives in the United States and has a social security number. So this is why the health insurance industry, as it's structured at the moment, is not fit for purpose. We have components of it, hospital systems, doctors' organizations, drug manufacturers, device manufacturers, all of whom are doing the job that we have handed them to do. And the end result of that is that healthcare costs continue to rise faster than inflation, and now twice what they are in other countries like ours, and the inability to actually provide health insurance for every American from cradle to grave. So let me stop at that point. Do you have anything to add, Mark?
No, and I always, my jaw drops when you tell the MRI story because it just boggles my mind that you would have people who would supposedly be looking to save money and actually find an advantage in doing the exact opposite. That just always, I find that flabbergasting. So we have a system then that is designed to fail, and it's doing a great job of that. We can see that in healthcare outcomes in this country. If you compare the United States to other developed nations, Europe, Japan, Australia, in terms of life expectancy, we are near the bottom in our life expectancy at every age group, 0 to 1, 1 to 5, 10 to 20, 30-year-olds, 40-year-olds, 50-year-olds. Finally, when you look at Americans' life expectancy, something magical happens at age 65. It starts to rise relative to other countries, so that by the time Americans are 90 years of age, assuming we've lived that long, we have the second longest life expectancy behind the Japanese. What changes at age 65? Medicare. Prior to that, you're changing jobs, you're getting a divorce, you're developing a chronic illness, your insurance goes away, it changes, your access to health care is not guaranteed. And as I mentioned earlier, the price of uninsurance is death. 1 out of 1,000 people who are uninsured die every year. That all goes away when you guarantee people access to health care. When you tell them that you can get the care you need, it will be paid for. Life expectancy immediately starts rising, which kind of shoots a hole in the argument that, oh, well, Americans die earlier than other countries because we're obese, because of different ethnic makeup, et cetera, et cetera. None of that really explains why everyone's life expectancy goes up to age 65. Other examples of this. Black men in this country live on average 4 years less than white men do, except for black men who get their care at the VA, at the Veterans Administration Hospital. Healthcare outcomes for black men are comparable or better than that for white men. And what's the big difference? Again, they have access to healthcare that's guaranteed. Price does not become an option. I should also mention that under that system, the doctors don't have any incentive to see any group of people as opposed to any other group of people. So there is no, shall we say, adverse selection of doctors against their patients. We know these things go on. Overall, the child born to a poor family is expected to live 15 years fewer than a child born to a wealthy family. A black woman giving birth has a 40 times greater chance of dying than a white woman giving birth. Our mortality rates for these totally preventable, totally treatable illnesses are far higher than in other countries, and they are far higher for certain ethnic groups compared to other ethnic groups. Single-payer systems, even within our own country, actually remedy that. So we have a lot of data that tells us that when you remove the cost question, people don't rush off to the doctor and get care they don't need. People get care that they need. We saw that in Canada when there was a switch from a multi-payer system to a single-payer system in 1972. There was not a sudden run on the bank, shall we say, where people were rushing to the hospital, rushing to doctors' offices to be seen. Healthcare utilization did not increase really that much. Part of it was because most people don't get care if they don't feel they need it, and part of it is also capacity. There are a certain number of doctors, a certain number of hospitals. That doesn't change, and it won't change once we change how the payment system works. So the idea that we're going to suddenly be swamping our available systems, it's a problem potentially, but it's a problem that can be dealt with. So the system that we have now delivers inequitable care, it delivers, to many people, poor care, and it delivers care that is far too expensive. So there are efforts to change this. They are not new. We had actually an effort to try to introduce a single-payer system going back as far as the 1920s. The labor movement was involved with that. It failed during the Red Scare of the 1920s. We had another chance under Harry Truman in the 1940s. Again, it failed. Again, the term socialized medicine, fear of socialism, fear of communism defeated it, and it died. Jack Kennedy, when he came to office, apparently was very interested in this. Teddy Kennedy, his younger brother, introduced a bill into Congress in 1972, and we decided as a nation to go with the plan introduced by President Nixon, which then introduced the idea that employers ought to be helping their employees pay for their health care. But all of these, as we know now, are stopgap measures that really address part of the problem, but don't really address the fundamental problems of cost control, access, expense. There are two bills right now if you want to talk about that a little bit.
Let me make one more
Yeah.
point about why these bills are being put forward, because
Right.
both of these bills are for a single-payer Medicare for all, where everyone is insured, number one, and everyone's insured through the same insurance company, which in this case would be a government-run program, Medicare or something very similar. So before we get to the bills, why is this a solution to the problems that we've outlined here of lack of access and inability to control costs? And the answer to that is that if you only have one payer, one insurance company, then it's impossible for that insurance company to adversely select against sick people or poor people, because it is tasked with insuring everybody, and that's what it does. So everybody's covered. The fact that everybody's covered also means that patients can't select against that insurance company because they are provided with health insurance from cradle to grave. So with a single payer, Medicare was the most obvious way to do this. It's not the only way to do it, but it's the most obvious way to do it given our current situation. With that single insurance company, then you guarantee that you will provide access to everybody. The other advantage that having a single payer is that you actually then would have a strong negotiating position in the marketplace for drugs, medical devices, and hospital and doctor services. And given that strong negotiating position, then you're in a better position to control costs, to control the rise of costs immediately, and to control costs compared to other expenses in our society over the long term, which is what other countries who all have some form of single-payer system with effective negotiating power in the marketplace, these other countries have lower healthcare costs than we do. So from the capitalist point of view, then the rational response to the situation that we have now is to obtain the negotiating power that a single payer would have to actually manage costs so that we have an efficient market, and at the same time we would provide health insurance for everyone, which is the purpose of these bills. And one other fact which is worth noting at this time from a capitalist point of view is that there is 30% waste in the delivery of healthcare in this country. Every dollar that is spent on healthcare, 67 cents goes to improving people's health, and 33% of it goes to what you might call administrative churn or other things that don't actually improve people's health. So what we're doing with our health insurance system at the moment is forcing employers, self-employed people, and anyone else who goes out to buy health insurance, forcing these people to buy from a supply chain which has 30% waste in it. Now, what businessman is going to go out and buy goods and services for his business from a supplier that has 30% waste in their supply chain? And what businessman is going to hire labor and pay them for 40 hours a week, but tell them that they only need to come to work 3 days a week? Nobody is going to do that in their right mind in a capitalist economy if they're going to have a successful company. But because of the way we have structured our health insurance, that's what we're asking our businesses and our self-employed people to do when they provide health insurance for their workers or for their families. And that is why these two bills that Mark is going to talk about are actually the only solution to the problems that we've outlined so far.
Okay. So, Fred, actually, I'd just like to correct a statistic. I said it earlier. The numbers run together in my head. Actually, mortality rates for black women are actually 10 times that than for Caucasian women. Still an appalling number.
In childbirth.
In childbirth, right, during childbirth. So the two bills, there's a House bill that's been sponsored for the last number of years by Senator Sanders of Vermont. There's a House bill, a Senate bill by Sanders, and then a House bill by Representative Jayapal from Seattle, Washington. Both of them propose pretty much the same thing. It's cradle to grave, universal health insurance for every American. You have a Social Security number, you're insured. All of them, both of them, guarantee payment for any medically recognized condition. They both cover dental care, hearing aids, and audio care, psychiatric care. There's some difference in how they pay for long-term care, nursing home care. Right now, Medicaid picks up a lot of that bill because we force people to become destitute before the government starts to pay for their long-term care. But that obviously is something that's going to be hammered out if and when these bills are passed. So the bills are there. They've been introduced for the last number of years, and I think they're very thoughtful. They're very well thought out. So we've been making a case of why it seems obvious, at least to us, why we need a single-payer, so-called Medicare for All system. So why is there so much controversy? Why is there so much confusion about this? So we thought we'd address some of the objections to a single-payer system that are constantly being brought up, and some of the perhaps misconceptions that are being brought up all the time. So the first one that I think that's gotten a lot of play recently is that we can't afford it. The Mercatus Institute at George Mason University recently came up with the number that it was going to cost $30 trillion, which is an appalling amount of money. So Jim, do you want to analyze why, what our response would be to that?
Well, the first question to ask when thinking about the cost of a single-payer system is to begin with the 30% waste that exists in the current system. And at least half of that 30% waste is due to insurance churn associated with the paperwork associated with having multiple insurance companies. And you see this when you go to the doctor, and there's a room somewhere in the doctor's office with people in it who are not wearing a white coat or a healthcare uniform, but are doing something else. They're not providing healthcare, and those are people in the doctor's office who are basically working on the insurance side of things. And then in the insurance company, there's a similar number of people doing their counterparts doing the same thing in the insurance company. And all of this costs money, and it doesn't really add anything to anybody's health. So there's a lot of waste in the system. At the moment, we spend about $3.3 trillion a year on healthcare. To put that number in context, we spend about $700 billion a year, so about a quarter of that to a fifth of that is spent on national defense. So the healthcare is a huge part of the US economy. It's about 18% at the moment. Other countries spend, other developed countries with successful healthcare systems spend between 8%, which is probably not enough, to about 14%, which provides very excellent healthcare available to everyone.
That's a percentage of the gross domestic product, right?
Product, yeah. So there's going to be savings on the table if you move to a single-payer system. That would be reasonable to expect. And it was actually confirmed by the Mercatus study that Mark mentioned, which was funded by the Koch brothers, came out of George Mason University, which is also heavily funded by the Koch brothers. And yes, it did put a price tag on Medicare for all of, what was it, $30 trillion? Mm-hmm. Yeah. But the study also demonstrated that compared to the cost of healthcare over that 10-year period going forward, the cost of healthcare, if we don't do anything, then a Medicare for All program would save $2 trillion over that same time period. So the total cost of healthcare to the country as a whole would actually be less under Medicare for All, as demonstrated by a study funded by the Koch brothers. Other economists might estimate those savings to be greater because they'd be less conservative in their assumptions. But the question as to whether there'll be savings from shifting to Medicare for All is basically what you might call settled law. It's off the table. There will be savings. The question really is, how are those savings going to be distributed? And that's a political question. It's really not an insurance question. So far, we've been talking about why the health insurance industry doesn't do a good job with the things it's tasked to do, provide access for everybody to health care and manage costs. But now the question is a political question. How are those savings going to be distributed? And we'll talk about that, I think, a little later. Or I can talk about it now, Mark, if you like.
You might as well get right to it.
Well,
But one point that I wanted to make about this is that when people are throwing out this $30 trillion number, it's often presented as though it's $30 trillion more than what we're paying right now. And what we're trying to emphasize here is that It's just the cost isn't added on to the current system. It's really the thing that changes is not how much money we're spending, although we'll probably be spending less. It's how it flows from the only source of money in this country, which is the people of this country, into the healthcare system. So Medicare for All is not $30 trillion added onto the system. It's a cheaper system where the money flows differently. So,
Right, right. I think the other point that we should make at this point here is that the money that individual Americans pay for health care, if they have health insurance, is typically a fraction of what that health insurance really costs. By law, a company that offers health insurance to its employees will pick up 80% of the cost of that health insurance, and the employee would pay 20%. The cost of health insurance to a company today for a family of a worker is about $2,000 a month, $2,000 to $2,500 a month. So the employee would pay $400 to $500 a month themselves, and the employer picks up the rest of the tab. The difference between the $400 that the employee pays and the $2,400, say, that the insurance actually costs, that $2,000 difference is sort of invisible to the employee, and that people don't factor that into the cost of their health care. But it actually is there because, one, that money could be used to pay them a salary, but it's not. It's used to pay for health care instead. And two, it's also not taxed. The employer doesn't pay tax on what it's an expense to the employer, so they don't pay tax on it. And what that does in effect is it subsidizes the cost of that health insurance, because a self-employed person will pay tax on their income, and they'll have to pay tax on the part of their income that they spend on health care. So anyone who's self-employed is actually subsidizing the health insurance of people who are employed by a company. And that's one of many somewhat surprising and worrisome inequities in our current system. So the cost of healthcare to an individual is hidden to a great extent. But we all pay that cost in one way or another, because when you go out and you buy services or you buy goods from a store or Amazon or whatever, then built into the cost of those services and goods is the cost of the health insurance for people who are working to produce or deliver those services or goods. So the cost it's not as if it doesn't exist, it's just hidden. If you move to a government-funded single-payer system, then the first fact, to reiterate what we've just said before, is that the total cost to the country as a whole for healthcare is going to be lower. The question then is, how do you distribute those costs, and how do you distribute the savings compared to our current system? And there are two ways to think about this. One way is that we would continue to distribute the costs of healthcare the same way that we do now. And what that looks like is that typical company situation, family of four, the health insurance for the employee costs $400 a month. That is true for the employee that's making $15,000 or $20,000 a year, basically $1,200 to $2,000 a month, and the employee who's making $200,000 a year. They all pay the same amount for their health insurance. And this is why health insurance is not affordable for low-wage workers, frontline workers. When I worked in the health insurance industry, I was working for a company that was selling health insurance to other large companies. And the company was in the difficult position of having its own low-wage frontline employees and people in call centers, the kind of people you talk to when you call up and ask a question about your policy. Then these people were, in many cases, unable to afford the health insurance that the company offered to them. And this was a difficult situation because we're trying to sell a product which is, we're encouraging other companies to use this product for their employees. And so what the company did was a very progressive action that they took. And they changed the cost of health insurance to an employee. Rather than it being a fixed $400 a month for a family, it was proportionate to the employee's income. So low-wage employees paid very little or even nothing for their health insurance, and people who were paid generously, like I was, ended up paying more for their health insurance than they were before. But what that did was it made health insurance affordable to everyone in the company. And when that was announced, along with other changes to the, including an increase in the minimum wage that the company paid to $15 an hour, then at an employee meeting where these changes were announced, an employee meeting held in a call center with low-wage employees, people were weeping in the room and went up to the CEO and other leaders of the company and said, "Thank you for the first time in my life, although I'm working 40 hours a week, and now I can afford to pay for my health insurance and know that when my child is sick, they can go and see the doctor." So this is an example of progressive payment for health insurance, that the way that health insurance would be paid for under Medicare for All proposal is that it would be paid for through progressive taxation. Now, let me reiterate that the total cost of this taxation, because there are savings across the healthcare system as a whole, $2 trillion according to the Koch brothers. So those savings means that the total cost of the taxation, yes, they will be new taxes, but the total cost of that will be lower than the current cost of healthcare in terms of the premiums that people pay, the premiums that companies pay, and the built-in cost of, hidden cost of healthcare in all the goods and services that we buy. So there will be an additional taxation, but that would replace costs for healthcare at the moment that are significantly larger, perhaps 20% larger than what you would pay with the taxes. So fact number one is that the total tax burden on the U.S. economy will be less than the current burden of paying for healthcare, health insurance. And then the second point is that if you fund this through progressive taxation, which is linked to people's income or to companies' income, then you make it affordable for everyone, because low-wage people and small companies starting up will not have to pay because they won't have much revenue or much wages. Then they will pay a small amount for their healthcare or a smaller amount than large companies and people who have very high incomes. And that will give us an economy, and a healthcare economy, which is affordable to everyone and in fact costs the whole country less in the end. And this, we think, will be beneficial to the U.S. economy. So let me tell another story now about a conversation that I had with a small businessman to illustrate the drag on the economy that the current system of health insurance and the way it's paid for causes. And this businessman was experienced in the selling and installation of equipment for municipal water systems, so pumps, filters, that kind of thing. And he was starting out his own company, and he told me that one, municipal water systems are in a very poor state of repair. They're old and they haven't been maintained or replaced properly, and so there's a big opportunity to sell equipment to municipalities for their water systems. And so the market's very, very great demand for this here. But he says the problem I have is that it takes about 4 years from the time I make, or my company makes, or my salesman makes an initial contact with a municipality, and we work with them and determine what their needs are, and then they have to go through a purchasing process that may take months to a year or two, and then the equipment has to be installed, and then we get paid. So from the time we get that first phone call to the time that the equipment is installed, working, and we get paid, maybe 3 to 4 years. And he said, I can't afford to bring on another salesperson or to increase my sales force, because if I do that, I have to pay a salary to my salesman, but there's no commission revenue for 3 to 4 years. So he has a cash flow problem because the bulk of his company's revenue is going to come in long after the work has been done by him and by his sales force. So he can't grow his company because of this cash flow problem, and his company is stuck with him and 2 salespeople. And it's impossible for him to bring on a 3rd or 4th salespeople, even though the business is out there. So how is this good for the American economy? This is not good for the economy, it's actually bad for the economy, because most of our job growth is growth in small companies with small employers. Under a Medicare for All system, paid for through progressive taxation, his company, a small company with limited revenue, would pay less for their healthcare costs than a large company, well established and able to manage its cash flow much better because it's been in business for a long time. For this reason, we believe that a Medicare for All single-payer system is going to be good for the US economy because 1, we'll spend less on wasteful stuff in healthcare, and 2, if it's funded through progressive taxation on incomes, then corporate and personal, then we're actually going to allow people to grow their businesses, and also people that are working for corporations now and would like to start a business but can't because they can't afford their own health care. If they have a small company, they'd be able to leave their current job and start that small company because their health insurance will be no longer tied to employment. It will be tied to the fact that they are a legal resident in the United States.
Yeah, and if you think about it, the cost of employer subsidized health insurance is like a tariff that we're laying on our own exporters. It was estimated back in 2004, the cost of the average auto worker's health insurance added $1,500 to the cost of every automobile manufactured in Detroit. So the cost of health insurance basically makes our manufacturers, the ones at least who are still in the United States, less competitive because we're laying a tariff on them ourselves so that our products are more expensive when we try to sell them overseas. Because of that, we also are encouraging our manufacturers to move their production out of the country where they don't have to pay for the health insurance of workers in other countries. So it is not to the advantage of almost any other industry in this country to be paying out this amount of money to the health insurance industry. Another myth or another objection that's always raised about implementing a Medicare for All program is the number of people who will lose their jobs. So it's estimated that about 1.7 million people might lose their jobs, but that's probably an overestimate because a certain percentage of the people who are working in the insurance industry will continue to be insured because the insurance industry actually provides billing services, I think, for Medicare. And that percentage of their workforce is not going to be unemployed. I would also point out that that number, 1.7 million, is approximately the number of people who are fired in the United States every year anyway. We have 60 million people in this country who lose their jobs annually. So, this is not that large a number added to that. The other thing about that is these are people who are skilled workers. I mean, they know how to use computers, they know how to do office work. It's not like there isn't any work for them out there. Both of the bills in Congress, by the way, do contain provisions for job retraining, but one wonders how much job retraining these people actually need. They know how to do the work of a corporate office, and that is a large part of what we do in the United States. So I think the objection that this is going to cause massive displacement of workers, it's going to cause massive unemployment, is actually wildly overblown. And then when you add to Jim's analysis that actually taking away the burden of paying for employee health insurance is going to allow small businesses in particular to start hiring more people and will free up people who have great ideas for entrepreneurial enterprises to be able to actually go out and do them. It stands to actually be a stimulus to the economy, not a sudden, sort of large dump onto the total burden of unemployment in this country. So we're hearing a lot of talk about all of these things about why Medicare for All is bad, why it's going to hurt us, and it's hard to understand, given the data you've presented and given the data that's out there, why are so many people saying things, saying Medicare for all is not a good idea, that it's not achievable, it's not going to solve the country's problems. Well, part of the problem, I think, is the fact that the system that we have already generates huge amounts of revenue for certain industries, particularly the pharmaceutical and the insurance industries. As Jim was pointing out, about a third of our healthcare budget goes to those industries for purposes that do not involve actually delivering healthcare. And those industries are very good at fighting back. I think we can all remember back in the 1990s when the Clintons had their attempt at healthcare reform that was strongly beaten down by I think with Harry and Louise ads on television that the insurance industry mounted. We ourselves went to a talk recently that was given at Brown University by supposedly a well-informed individual who used that example to tell us why it's just not possible to achieve Medicare for all because the insurance industry won't let us have it. Even organizations that you would think should be advocating progressive or at least equitable policies like this are not doing it. There's something called the Center for American Progress, which advises the Democratic Party on formulating public policy. And yet when you look at who's funding them, they're being funded by corporations, corporations including the pharmaceutical and insurance industries, the very industries that have the most to lose by implementing a system like Medicare for all. So there is a great deal of money at stake here, and it is not surprising, therefore, that we're hearing a lot of actual misinformation or sort of very skewed analysis as to why this program won't work. All the way down to the bare bones presentation we heard the other day, where we were just told, well, it can't work because the insurance industry won't let us have it. I'm not sure that that argument has ever stood up well in American history, that it's impossible to achieve because a certain group of people won't let us have it. I think we can think of a number of examples through history where that, in fact, was exactly not the case. There was a huge amount of money being made by people who were manufacturing buggies and whips and racing and horse harnesses back in the 1890s, 1900s. Those companies don't really control the market anymore. There's something called the automobile. There was a very strong opinion among men that women ought not to vote, and women were not at all in favor of that idea. They stood up, they campaigned for it, and despite the fact that at that point the vast majority of the wealth in this country was controlled by men who did not want them to have the vote, they got the vote. And I think the most sort of compelling example is slavery. Back in the 1840s, 1850s, a very wealthy, very politically powerful landed class, mainly in the southern part of the United States, owned human capital. They owned slaves, people who had worked the fields for them and were not compensated for their labor. This was decried by people who were not benefiting from the system as being immoral, or at least not being ethical. And, again, we elected an anti-slavery president, Abraham Lincoln, and a certain amount of negotiating involving 150,000 American dead on the battlefields of the Civil War had to take place, but we did get rid of slavery. I'm hoping that we don't have to have a civil war to get rid of health insurance, private health insurance, and actually get a system that keeps people alive and keeps them healthy. But to say that we can't do this because financial interests will not let us is, well, it's un-American, and it's wrong. And history has proven it wrong again and again and again. And there are, again, we belong to an organization called Physicians for a National Health Program. There are 20,000 physicians nationwide, and this is what we're campaigning for. We like to go around, we'd like to talk to people. We are very glad and very grateful to have been invited by Pat Ford onto this show to present our opinions. But we feel that the more people know what the facts are, the more people understand why the system we have exists the way it is and why it isn't working, and the fact that there is a viable solution, I think it's important that we work hard to try to get the message out there. Because if people are informed, the American people generally don't stand for being exploited for very long. Winston Churchill supposedly said at one point, the great thing about the Americans is that they will always find the best solution to every problem, but only after they've exhausted every other alternative. We've spent the last 100 years exhausting every other alternative, and we have found painfully that they don't work. We need a system that is efficient, that is equitable, that is affordable to all Americans, and that we already have a great deal of experiences with. Medicare has been around since the 1960s. We know how this program works. And to just say it's too radical, the country isn't ready for it, really all we're proposing is changing the age of eligibility. Right now it's 65. Why not make it age 1? If you want to do that in 10-year increments, just next year it's going to be age 55, the year after that age 45. You can do that. But it's a system that we know works because we've been working it. We've been running it. The government's been running it for a number of decades now. And we know that it works, and we believe strongly that it's the system that we need.
Yeah, exactly. Medicare, which serves 65 million Americans over the age of 65, is the most popular health insurance program in the United States. It's receives higher customer satisfaction ratings than private insurance, any private insurance company. So the government is capable of running a health insurance program that is very successful. And people who have Medicare, they enjoy the benefit of, one, having to enroll only once when they start drawing their Social Security, and then two, they can go to almost any doctor in the country and to almost any hospital in the country. But if there was only a single payer, then all doctors and all hospitals and health systems would have to participate in it. So they enjoy the benefit of being able to go anywhere they want in the country, and they would enjoy that in the future too. With Medicare, the government does not tell you which doctor you can see. You're allowed to see whatever doctor you want to. And it does not tell the doctor what treatment they can use or where they can send their patients. Medicare, as Mark mentioned earlier, provides coverage, health insurance coverage, for all medically accepted conditions that are recognized by medical science, and it provides coverage for people who have one of those conditions with all treatments that are shown to be effective by medical science. It also has a provision for experimental treatments which are unproven but look promising, and it arranges ways for those treatments to be fully explored, their effectiveness to be fully explored, and then brought under the coverage of Medicare. So there's not going to be a stifling of innovation because of a government program.
Yeah, in fact, a lot of the primary research that's done in medical science is already done by the government through the National Institutes of Health, through the Centers for Disease Control, through the National Science Foundation. So the government is already sponsoring a huge percentage of the total research into medical treatments that are going on right now. Medicare itself, I think, actually funds medical education for residents in training.
That's true. Medicare does fund the education of every doctor that's been educated in the United States or has done their postgraduate training in the United States. Has been the benefit of Medicare funds to some extent, and in many cases to a great extent. The other, I think, point about concern about Medicare is that it's a government program, and therefore it'll be like the DMV or something. Medicare is...
Let's throw them under the bus.
Well, here in Rhode Island. And so the DMV, there's a lack of capacity. That's why there are lines, and that's why there's waiting periods in the National Health Service in the UK, because the UK spends only 8% of their GDP on healthcare, and it's not enough. They don't have enough capacity. But the problem with wait times and Medicare for All, a government program, is not that there would be increased wait times for capacity for services in the United States. We have the capacity to provide health care to everyone that needs it. We just have people that can't access it because they don't have insurance and they can't afford it. So we can come back to wait times in a minute. But the thing that I really wanted to make here is that the Medicare program, as Mark mentioned earlier, is actually delivered by private insurance companies or other companies that have the information technology infrastructure and the customer service and contract management capability to provide, answer patients' questions and to sign contracts with doctors and hospitals and manage those contracts when the claim comes in and has to be paid. So this capacity for, first of all, the government does not actually deliver the Medicare program. The government has a set of rules about how it's supposed to be done, but it's actually done on private platforms of the private companies. And those companies use those platforms to deliver the private insurance that everybody else has who doesn't have Medicare. And Medicaid is also delivered on private platforms. This is how Ross Perot made his money when he ran for president in the 1990s. So the capacity to actually deliver a Medicare for All program already exists in the United States. We have a delivery side with doctors, hospitals, and other services that patients need that serves the needs of 300 million Americans. There's 10 million that don't have insurance and probably don't use these things very much. But that would only be a small increase in the capacity required. So the capacity is already there. And the ability to deliver Medicare for 330 million Americans is clearly available. And when that Medicare program is delivered to people, then they're happy with it. They're unhappy because Medicare doesn't cover certain things at the moment, but the bills that Mark mentioned would increase that coverage so that all the services that people need that are medical services then would be covered.
So I think we've said all that we have time to say. We can go on for hours. We'd like to thank Pat Ford again for allowing us to be on his show.
I do have one question for you.
Yes, sir.
Speaking from afar because of the way our studio is set up.
Right.
We just have a couple minutes left, but to me, this question, regardless of where you stand on it, is perhaps one of the 2 or 3 most important questions facing our federal government in the upcoming elections. Do you feel that it's been given adequate? I mean, we've had 200 or 300 seemingly debates on national TV at 7-Elevens
like
everywhere,
that,
in the drive-through at McDonald's. They'll debate anywhere. But do you feel like this subject is being given adequate coverage and analysis by the chattering classes as well as the candidates?
No, I think we strongly disagree with that, and that's partly why we're here tonight and partly why we spend our time talking to groups of people who are interested in this. We think it's not adequately covered for maybe 2 different groups of reasons. One is because there are powerful financial interests in healthcare that distort the debate with statements like, as Mark mentioned a few minutes ago, this is impossible, the social change is too great and so on, which we don't accept. The healthcare system is a socially constructed thing and it can be changed in the same way that slavery was abolished or universal suffrage came in and so on. This can be done. But the debate is limited because there's that money that is feeding that argument.
Right.
And I think the second reason it's not adequately debated is because it is inherently relatively complicated. And you have to understand how insurance works, and then you can understand why it doesn't work for healthcare in the system that we have, and why a single-payer system would solve those 2 problems of cost and access. And I think politicians are, we know because we talk to politicians, they are not expert in this at all. And the media covering it, journalists to a great extent, also do not grasp the nuances of this. And so the debate comes down to polling figures rather than the substance of policy. And this is a huge disservice to the American people because, as you said earlier in your intro, Pat, that this is a big chunk of our economy and is a key factor in this election, because how this issue rolls out is going to determine how our economy and how the health of our population actually evolves over the next decade.
And I think the other part of the problem, too, continuing the same theme, is that the political classes are reluctant to take on large industries that contribute so heavily to re-election campaigns, to the political parties. The argument that we heard up at the Watson Institute at Brown was pretty much that the insurance industry will kill any attempt to actually provide reform. Part of that is, if you look at statistics, 80% of national elections are won by the person who spent the most money. And when you alienate 2 large corporations, 2 large industries, which are very generous political contributors, by that calculus, you are, sort of reducing your chances of re-election. So a lot of politicians do not want to talk about this openly because they don't want to, bite the hand that feeds them, as it were.
Yeah.
No, I'm particularly frustrated with the media's obsession with handicapping elections
Oh, exactly.
as opposed to having, Bruce Springsteen, and someday I'll get to the amount of stations with nothing on, but Bruce Springsteen wrote a song in the 90s, I think. Was at this point, if it was a 2019 equivalent, it would be 15,000 stations and there's nothing on.
That's right.
7 or 8 movie sharing services and there's nothing
Nothing on,
on.
right.
And with the type of bandwidth the media has, what is it, the old joke from a certain movie, ESPN 8, the Ocho? I mean, you could have a channel dedicated just, we call this show Wonk Central because we embrace the issues in the conversation. If you can overcome that, and then I guess the other question I have is, are we too polarized as a nation to allow conversations to take place anymore? Do you see certain eyes just drawing shut the minute you mention the word Medicaid?
Well, I travel quite a lot, and I talk to people about this because they ask you, well, what do you do? And I say one of the things I do is talk about this. And what I find when I talk to people one-on-one, and I tell them pretty much what we've talked about on this show here, that their scales fall from their eyes, and they say things like, I didn't know, I didn't realize that. So I think this is not, to my mind, this is not a partisan issue.
Shouldn't be.
It's because, as I've mentioned several times, from the point of view of having a successful capitalist economy, we actually can't afford this healthcare system that we have right now. It's a drag on the economy, and it needs to be changed. So when you look at it from that point of view, then people on the right are interested in having a more efficient, a better economy, and people on the left are interested in the justice issues of having access for everybody at an affordable cost. The two things come together with a single-payer Medicare for all solution. The problem is that this is presented as an us versus them issue, and it's really not. As I tried to point out earlier, it's an us versus the current system issue, which forces people to do bad things.
Too many decisions in this economy are made based on artificial exogenous events, and exogenous events being taxation, exogenous event being the overwhelming cost of healthcare. So when you're making a business decision based on that, the market can't be competitive.
Right.
Right.
So I am, as the host, I'm going to remain neutral on this. I have very strong feelings politically, but the point of this is to explore the issue. And I am so grateful for you, both of you, to spend the Friday night at the height of the holiday season exploring the issue. And my hope is that, again, to get people to listen to both sides, to kind of break down that wall, that this same, I'll say this, I won't ask you to agree or disagree, I find the mainstream media, I'm not into the conspiracy theories, I'm not into the, ultimately I find them to be lazy.
Yes.
And my father always talked about the lowest common denominator, or the path of least resistance. And by doing that, they take this remarkable ability to communicate to people and just render it useless.
That Fox panel that I referred to earlier did exactly that. They had 6 people, I think, around the table, and all of them talked about exactly what you're saying, handicapping the chances of something happening. What was Senator McConnell going to do? How would the Democrats respond? The only one person out of the entire group actually just looked at the data and made a statement based on it, and the other people looked at him as though he was crazy. Because I think you're exactly right. It is, I don't know how this idea became so widely embraced, but it is media, when they're talking about the economy, when they're talking about issues that affect Americans, they're only allowed to examine it from a political point of view.
Right.
I mean, that's insane.
Which unfortunately they're what should be considered apolitical issues.
Exactly.
Yeah.
It should be decided on data. And on, what are the needs of the people of the country?
Well, again, my thought on this, and I'd love to get your reaction to this, is having spent a fair amount of time with the media, and there's some wonderful people locally, but in general, you can draw a corollary these days between mass media and worldwide wrestling. And in worldwide wrestling, we're all of a certain age here. There was the guy who adapted the good guy outfit, right? And then there was the bad guy.
Oh, yes.
And sometimes
who
they
they were.
change, right? But ultimately, if you were, they didn't. They adopted this persona. It was entertainment, and a great deal of our media has become entertainment. So people have been trained, I believe, to enjoy the conflict, much like they would watch a wrestling match.
Yep.
And
Yep. That's a good analogy.
you know,
Sad, but it's a good analogy.
and if you go to efforts, there's some great independent media in Rhode Island. Interestingly enough, for a state that's so tiny, that has all four major media outlets, if you will, to have so much in, every on a complete range from myself to Steve Alquist and everybody in between, that it's symptomatic of what's lacking today, and again, fact-based, emotionless, non-skewed conversations about issues. And like I said, I applaud your efforts, and I hope you continue this.
Well,
Thank you so much.
Yeah, we're very grateful to have been here this evening. Thank you very much.
I can't think of a better way to spend a Friday night.
Talking about issues. Interestingly enough, we torture sometimes our producer Joe, who's a stalwart back there. Sometimes we have people here till all hours because they just want to keep the conversation going. But I have a gentleman waiting for me in New Mexico now. We're going from this in terms of being a contrarian and not fulfilling the needs of the instant gratification of today's media. In the next hour, we're going to talk about the impact of the war on drugs on narcoterrorism, Central America, the asylum system that's under fire right now, and other light stuff. And then at 8 o'clock, we're going to have a conversation for about 45 minutes or so on red flag laws. Other than that,
Business as usual.
you'll get none of. If you're looking for a serious conversation on the Peloton bicycle ad, sorry, wrong place. Well, gentlemen, thank you.
Thank you so
very
much.
much.
Thank
and
you
we will
so much.
we will continue this. We will continue this conversation. Have wonderful holidays.
Great, you
whatever your
too.
tradition is, and we're going to share this everywhere. We're going to try and gin up some. I'm going to kidnap 30 or 40 people at a time, have an intervention, make them watch, and we'll take it from there. All right.
Thanks so much.
All right, folks, I'm going to be back in just a couple minutes. Professor Andrew Hernandez of the Western New Mexico State University is going to be joining us again on the air. As I mentioned, we're going to be talking about narcoterrorism. We're going to be talking about asylum seekers. We're going to be talking about, was a president of a partner country in Central America, was his brother just arrested for drug trafficking? Yes, he was. We are the Coalition, loud and proud, outrage porn-free, civilly disobedient media, broadcasting live on the Worldwide Coalition Network here at the Go Local Live Broadcast Center. Stay tuned, folks. We'll be right back. And we are the Coalition, loud and proud, outrage porn-free, civilly disobedient media, broadcasting live on the Worldwide Coalition Network here at the Go Local Live Broadcast Center, deep in the heart of the city we love, Providence, Rhode Island. Facebook.com/The Coalition Radio, on the mighty Twitter at Coalition_radio, and of course, the mothership, coalitionradio.us. Should you hear this show in the coming days, weeks, we'd ask you just to take a moment and follow us, like us, do all the normal stuff. Again, your support of us on social media allows us to sort of break through the noise. In the prior session, we had two esteemed doctors join us and talk about single-payer health insurance, a topic that you're not going to typically get in any sort of detail, really anywhere on the media. It's independent media that provides us the opportunity to have conversations with them, and like our guest, who is now officially, as we said last time, a repeat offender here on the Coalition. Professor Andrew Hernandez is on the faculty of the Western New Mexico University. We've time and time again, we've referred to the astonishing array of courses he teaches, whether it be the history of the border and the warfare and the civil strife and the issues that surround Texas and New Mexico and Mexico from the turn of the 18th and 19th century on forward, whether it be issues surrounding governments like Nicaragua in Central America and some of the challenges they face in terms of infrastructure and government. On a little bit more salacious level, but equally as important, talking about narcoterrorism, the asylum system, refugees, cross-border transportation, and of course the drug war, which of course is the center, if you will, the epicenter, the ground zero for so many of the conflicts, so many of the challenges facing us both on our Latin American border and for folks in Central and Latin and South America. So it is a great pleasure that I reintroduce us to Professor Hernandez. Thank you again for joining us. Merry Christmas and the best of all to your family. Thank you for spending some time on a Friday night with us.
Thank you, Pat. I'm happy to be here.
We have an awful lot of fun, and I hope sometime soon. I mean, does Western New Mexico University? It's sort of a tongue twister. What is the mascot there, by the way?
The Mustang.
The Mustangs. Does the home of the Mustangs do electronic courses yet? Can we take one of your courses as a far away student?
You can. My entire load this term is online.
Really?
And that's going to be true for the spring as well. So I'll make a cheap plug here. I have a class on Latin America and the drug war in the spring. I have a class on the drug wars again in the spring. And I have classes on World Civ and Modern Latin America in the spring. Kind of more general survey courses.
Holy cow. Now, do you have to be a matriculating student at the home of the Mustangs, the Western New Mexico University, to take your courses?
We have many people who already have degrees who come back just to further their education, and they take the classes for credit and for audit.
Wow, all right. So we're gonna have, over the break, we're gonna have to figure out a way to publicize that, because I have a feeling that there's things that you're going to talk about in those classes you're not going to get at a New England liberal arts school. Just a reflection, of course, of your not only your academic pursuits, but your kind of feet on the street role there, living just, as we like to say, 33 miles north of the Mexican border in scenic small town America, Deming, New Mexico, which actually, if you get a chance to go down there, by the way, I've gotten word that up in Albuquerque, there is talk of a minor league baseball or soccer stadium. Yeah, and we don't like public money going into stadiums like that at the Coalition. So I've already spoken with a couple of people on that issue. I'm going to do everything I can for no reason other than to get back to New Mexico, try and wangle a trip out of this one. But the
interesting news just today, Amazon had said they wouldn't move to New York City without some very generous subsidies, and lo and behold, they're moving there anyway.
Amazing. It's sort of like that six-figure job in government. That they always seem to get about 220,000. I always say, I wonder if they would have taken it for 170. And when you offer value, and by the way, New Mexico is an astonishingly beautiful state. I was blown away by it when I was there just a few months ago. I think it's a question of government just finding the beauty in itself and what it has to offer people without having to, lay down, open up the larder. I could see how people of a variety of backgrounds would love to live in a place like New Mexico. It's really, again, it's an astonishing place. And yet, I don't know it's on the tips of everyone's tongue to go there. I think it's just really up to the New Mexican government to point out, the lifestyle, the affordability relatively to many parts of the country, and all the beauty. And I think I wish they would do more of that than just feel like they have to stroke a check.
The local joke is that just about everybody who lives here at one point or another has been told they're not a citizen of the United States. So I'll make a cheap plug here. There's a blog called One of Our 50 is Missing, and there's actually a book decades ago published by the Albuquerque Journal of various anecdotes of people asked for their passport or told that they can't mail order something because the seller only ships to the United States and that kind of thing. Those are daily stories, but New Mexico does try to stay on the map, especially for domestic tourism in the U.S.
Absolutely. So we've got a couple of things we want to cover this week. Let's talk about the asylum system. It would appear, and there are always unintended consequences to legislation. There are always unintended consequences, particularly when in this administration, and I'm a critic of this administration, when it comes to their views, if you will, if you want to dignify them with that, with their views on immigration. I've always alleged, and I'm not going to ask you to comment on this, but I've always alleged that this is a ready, shoot, aim approach to the dynamics that make up an increasingly sophisticated yet increasingly troubled geo-economic politics between Central America and in our border, particularly given the presence of a significant manufacturing space in and around northern Mexico. So what's happening here? Give us a snapshot.
So I'll go really big, and then we'll hone in a bit on my area. Mm-hmm. We've talked about this before on a few other shows, but the primary problem here is that there's a global problem. There are, as I've mentioned before, arguably more people who are displaced right now across the globe. The UN High Commission on Refugees puts the number north of 70 million people. More people displaced right now than in World War II itself. And so there's a little bit of arguing back and forth on the data that maybe it's just close to the number of people who were displaced in World War II. Neither one of those is really the neighborhood you want to be in, though. It says a lot about how the magnitude of this crisis. And we take a look at the magnitude of the crisis. When you have a global problem like this, it's really a time, even though this light seems to have gone out, that the United States could serve as a leader. And I just don't see our country doing that anymore. It's been waning for a few decades now, but it really seems to be on the decline right now. And certainly no other country is stepping up. China is interring Muslims in the West as rapidly as they can in these re-education camps. For as much as China is described as an economic power, it's certainly not a moral leader in the world. Mm-hmm. Germany isn't able to step up, even though they have tried. And so there is a vacuum, essentially, of leadership here. Now, we look at the United States. It's common for Americans to think that we take in the largest number of people in the world. We do not. In October, there was actually a net of 0 new refugees taken into the United States, based on federal statistics. Mm-hmm. So there are so many things at play here. Probably one of the major problems right now, if we want to look at how the Trump administration is distinct from predecessors who also took a tough line on immigration, it's that there's really not a cohesive policy. And that's what really gets into a lot of the stories that are making news today. And so you have talk, for example, what's been referred to but really hasn't been negotiated very successfully across the globe, the idea of a safe third country agreement where an asylum seeker might not get their first choice of country to enter, but they will still instead be able to find entry into a safe third country. The agreements that the United States has negotiated since the summer are with Honduras, El Salvador, and Guatemala, the countries that are frequently referred to as the Northern Triangle. These are, even if we think of all the active fire zones in the world, these are the 3 deadliest countries in the world right now, with Honduras at the top of those. And so even though doublespeak has taken on a whole new meaning in 2019, nobody quite has the chutzpah to call those three countries safe third countries. So instead, these agreements have been referred to as asylum cooperation agreements, where people who are trying to present themselves at the U.S. border will instead be sent to, or in some cases, sent back to those countries.
Right, and this is. It sounds so innocent in a way, but from my reading, this represents a grotesque distortion of a worldwide tradition of asylum, in the notion that you are sending people directly back to the nation that they sought asylum from, which inevitably is a death sentence for many.
For many, it is. There's a different form of perversion at work here. Imagine, if you will, a Cuban or a Nicaraguan or a Venezuelan asylum seeker. They wouldn't be sent back to their home country that they're fleeing from under this agreement, but they would instead find themselves on a plane to Honduras, Guatemala, or El Salvador, which is, for people fleeing those three countries, is definitely for people fleeing Nicaragua. They did not trade up by entering one of these three other countries.
Right. But by any stretch. So what are the implications? I mean, you've had other countries, is my understanding, please correct me when I'm wrong, not if, but when I'm wrong, but you've had other countries establish relations like this, but ultimately it was always the intent for the asylum seeker to get some level of relief, if you will. So seeing the inevitability of how, as we like to say here at the Coalition, of how the movie ends, we know how this movie ends. Has there been any public reaction from the Trump administration whatsoever?
This is something that's lauded as a success by the Trump administration. This is something that is keeping, allegedly, more people from fleeing to the United States. And part of the reason that I think the optics there are so successful is that Mexico has essentially established tent cities along major border cities, Juarez, Matamoros, Tijuana, where people who are hoping to receive asylum by presenting themselves at the U.S. border are waiting. And these city is not a misnomer. There are thousands of people waiting for entry. And in December, we may not be Rhode Island, but Juarez is not a great place to be in a tent at night.
Right. No, and having had a brief opportunity to visit some of the conditions that asylum seekers who were stuck on the other side of the border, if you will, have to face, it's I mean, we're talking a humanitarian and health crisis here, potentially, on areas that are already challenged economically. Some of them are desperately poor areas. I mean, you get away from I think folks have this concept of every border crossing being like Tijuana, with American manufacturers just on the other side, and this gay town center where people are engaging in trade and American college students are having too much to drink. That's the aberration. That is not even remotely. I mean, talk about Palomas, Mexico. I mean, again, and this is not to disparage the people there. I met some wonderful people who send their children to school every day in the United States. You've got a real, from my sense as an outsider, a real community spirit between Palomas and Deming and some of the other border towns. But when you look at a real border town, if you will, like that, what are some of the economics there? How desperate are some of these communities?
Well, they're extremely desperate. I've mentioned previously that Mexico's made great strides in infrastructure, but in some areas it still hasn't. Palomas is a great place to visit. If you're looking for well-paved roads, though, that's not the place to go.
Right.
And or if you're looking for a potable water system, that's not the place to go. But I don't want to, have us just dunking on Mexico here, because those are things that are still coming to parts of the United States as well. So
Flint.
The city of Columbus, the village of Columbus, its water system was potable, but it wasn't. It still degraded local residents' teeth until just 10 years ago.
Wow.
I mean, this is the first decade of the 21st century that municipal water system was up to the specs that other people would tolerate.
So, on top of all of this, we have the continued, if you will, for lack of a better term, degradation of the government structure throughout Mexico at the state level. And it's important to understand that the Mexican government, you've got a federal government there, but it would appear from an outsider's perspective that, much like the United States, so much of local policy and as a result, the living conditions of people in that communities are dictated at the state level. Am I correct in that? Where does real policy hit the road for most Mexicans?
To some degree, that's true, but the real problem here is the same problem that we have. It's not a question of whether or not there are resources, it's how they're distributed. And so last time we talked about that horrific cartel attack in Sonora, just not too far across the border, where the Mormon colonist families were very brutally murdered. Basically when Mexico is sending Sikhs back to India in order to do a favor for the Trump administration and prevent those folks from presenting themselves at the U.S. border, that's money that they're not spending on trying to interdict cartel activity. It's money that they're not spending on infrastructure. All the money that we're spending on these various enterprises, these various endeavors, there are so many other ways to spend this funding. But the reality is that, in a lot of ways, we're talking about a resource misallocation. In Mexico's case, it's particularly onerous because we're talking about the expenditure of money, of Mexican tax dollars to further U.S. policy.
How is that met with the citizenry of Mexico? How strong, and this is, the fact that I'm asking you this question, and I'm so very political, is an indictment, if you will, of the American media, because, like so many Americans, I see Mexico as this sporadic outbreak of incredible amounts of violence, followed by nothingness. Is the citizenry up in arms? Have they been cowed, if you will, by this rampant narco-terrorism, which seems to be spiking again?
They tend to try to find accommodations. And not to belabor, not to keep trying to put the United States and Mexico on an even keel, but we might as well ask how the residents of Miami are dealing with living in that city after the police opened fire in broad daylight against thieves, right? Not murderers, but thieves, right? And murdered their hostage and wounded several bystanders.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, in fact, go back many years to the riots in Miami, and it was interesting that the UK government, of all folks, pointed out the hypocrisy of Americans' condescending attitude towards, perhaps borderline first, second, and third world nations, when in fact atrocities like that happen in America, far too often.
They do.
Well.
And I don't want to diminish the United States by saying that. What I want to say is that it's far too easy to fall into the temptation of demeaning these other countries and minimizing the problems that we have here.
Right. We have schools that are in outright failure. We've got issues with water systems and basic infrastructure around the nation breaking down. And, all one need to do is read the Department of Justice 2 reports on Ferguson to understand that racially, we can't go looking towards other people's treatment of indigenous natives with any air of superiority whatsoever.
Ferguson's an interesting case to mention because, you asked me about my class load for the spring. I'm smiling when I say this because that's my inappropriate reaction to everything. My class on Latin America and the Cold War is essentially, unless you study the Holocaust, it's a study in the worst possible treatment of human beings by other human beings. It is the darkest of dark material. It is death squads. It is soccer stadium massacres. Right. It is the disappearance of men and women and children. It's children cut out of their mother's womb and adopted by military families. All of this goes on at a time like that in these places that we dismissed as developing. But you just mentioned Ferguson. And, we should be terrified by how many of the Ferguson activists have been turning up dead in the last year and a half. Mm-hmm. And how fruitless the leads are to this point to identify the people who are burning Ferguson activists to death in their own cars, or other blatant, other horrific crimes.
No, this past week on let's just say he hasn't been met with violence. A week ago on our show, we covered the case of the curious, not so curious case of Ross Ulbricht, who was the in charge, the creator of the Silk Road internet site, and we had his mother on to discuss. While the treatment hasn't been brutal, the double life sentence for essentially an economic crime is stunning. The level of corruption in the federal government's judicial system in trying to foist upon him criminal charges of a violent nature is stunning. And the fact that there are, at this point, federal officers who are incarcerated because of theft related to the investigation. So, yeah, you're right. I've seen the enemy, and he is us.
I regret that I'm not very familiar with that case, but you take a look at the course of the drug wars, and I mean the number of it's especially bad when you could break it down by race and ethnicity and gender, but the number of people in the United States that are incarcerated for nonviolent crimes
is staggering. As a libertarian, I think you know how I feel about the war on drugs, which is, the genesis of yours and my meeting, if you will, to start out with, as well as immigration. And so speaking about incarceration and corruption at the highest level, how's that for a segue? We are now faced with the spectacle of one of the triads, if you will, one of those three countries, the Honduras, the brother of the president. And on a humorous side, you think back to Bill Clinton's brother-in-law or Jimmy Carter's brother, and it seems so humorous, but you have the spectacle of the brother of a sitting president of a partner in America's war on immigration and quote-unquote war on drugs being found guilty of drug trafficking. Holy cow. Tell us more, please.
So the brother Antonio Hernandez, and I need to say too, in case anybody's listening who perhaps isn't as familiar with Hispanic surnames or Latino surnames, there's no relation here. This is the Smith of Latino surnames, or Garcia. These are the Smith and Jones.
Right.
So when I say that Antonio Hernandez was convicted of drug trafficking, no relation here.
Okay.
But yes, he was. And I think that one of the most telling things is that the testimony in the trial, witnesses corroborated that the president of Honduras had benefited financially and was involved in the trafficking himself as well. And there are mass demonstrations in Honduras centered on that. But of course, the president, Juan Orlando Hernandez, was not put on trial yet, and is dismissing the charges. So shockingly, says that he's not guilty. But there was some pretty compelling evidence that, yes, that he was involved and has benefited.
Well, when you look at the economic power of the cartels in general, and I know that there's one can, and again, feel free to challenge my analogy here. In the way that in the 1920s, 30s, 40s, 50s, 60s, that we used to follow the Gambino families and the different, the mafia families, one could almost and should analyze the various drug trafficking cartels, particularly in an era when you've got El Chapo, being taken away, his son going through the process. I guess happens when a son emerges as the new power in charge of a cartel. You've got this mass, this chaos, this change happening amongst the cartels. How do we find that? How are we shocked, if you will, that this doesn't extend itself to the political leadership at the highest level? I mean, should we be surprised by this at this point?
If you're paying attention, you probably shouldn't be, but it's easy not to pay attention, right?
Right. I mean, who? I guess to your question, who in the United States is following the nuances of power shifting in Central American countries? Well, the quick answer is no one, and the answer should be everyone.
So, I mean, you do have the professionals, the as gutted as the State Department is, it has highly competent people who study this sort of thing. I will guarantee you, though, that there are a larger number of Hondurans who are in the U.S. without documentation, or who are here legally and who are further convinced they don't want to go home, or who are sitting at one of these tent cities on the border knowing that there's no way that they can return to that it's worth sitting there in hives of crime and communicable disease, suffering in the hopes that they don't have to go back. And I do want to make a distinction, too. There's a bit of a skein at work here, but to some degree we have cartel activity, and to some degree we have gang activity that are tied into these various webs of drug trafficking in other countries. Mexico's most certainly known, cartel is most commonly associated with Mexico, and some of those cartels have reached into other countries in Central America. But there's quite a bit of highly organized gangs that are involved here as well. And that's especially true in Honduras and El Salvador.
I think after the Christmas holiday, we could probably spend an hour talking about, I mean, because you've just brought up a real revelation to me. Where do the gangs begin and end, and where do the cartels begin and end? How do we distinguish between the two? I mean, there's a symbiosis there. That's stunning, but at the same time, they are very distinct animals. We've all been treated to all the stories now about MS-13, thanks to our president. I mean, who should we fear the most as Americans?
We should fear those of us who aren't paying attention to what's going on more than anything. Mm-hmm. None of us wants to have MS-13 at the Thanksgiving dining table. Mm-hmm. These are hardened criminals, but. I have a fear of sharks too. I'm just not. That's probably not the way I'm going to check out. You can have a healthy fear of things, but we need a sense of proportion.
Right.
And as far as where the problem began, so now you can be awake at 3 a.m. when I am. The gang problem in Central America, if it did not begin in U.S. prisons, it was exacerbated by them, by the number of asylum seekers in the 80s who were fleeing those countries. Who were serving sentences in U.S. prisons, principally in Los Angeles, but in other major cities, who were then absorbed into gangs in those prisons as a survival mechanism. And once their time was done, they were deported back to their home country and brought some very sought-after skills with them.
Which opens up another avenue of approach and reproach to the American war on drugs, because, again, mass incarceration proved to be, if you will, a petri dish for advanced criminal techniques. And think of mass incarceration, if you will, and I'm not trying to be a punk here, but it's sort of the Facebook of criminal activity. You bring together people who may or may not come from a violent background into close quarters with people who are extremely violent and live in an extra-legal society within the prison community. What the hell do we think is going to happen? I mean, should we be surprised?
I think too many people are. I think that most of them shouldn't be. If we look at the prison system, what elements of it can we sincerely say are geared towards rehabilitation? Mm-hmm. And so to go back to that point about resource allocation earlier, most states spend twice as much on each prisoner that they house than they spend on each pupil in a public school.
Yeah. So what we've got is a complete rat's nest, is what you're telling me.
There is, which I guess means the good news is you pick one problem and start at it, and it'll impact the others, but there sure are a lot of problems.
If you're the State Department of these United States, and all of a sudden your ambassador is confronted with the reality, you can't even really pretend at this point, how do you maintain government relationships with a known drug trafficker? It seems like we've reached that sort of final threshold where we can't even pretend that family is a family of honor, if you will, for lack of a better term. What do we do?
They continue to do so. They will not legitimize these governments under, high profile engagements and things like that. But let's take Nicaragua for an example. We now have had a run of several very competent ambassadors under multiple administrations that have served there. And they don't spend their public time having dinner with the Ortegas. They spend their public time in mass, which is itself a critique of the administration and has cracked down on the Catholic Church in that country.
Interesting.
And so this is anecdotally what I have observed, how the professional diplomats can reconcile when they're serving in a place that's a kleptocracy or in a criminal organization.
Interesting. So, if you will, I'll call it, for lack of a better term, the Jesuit model, where you've got, a priesthood that is actively engaged in reform politics. That's essentially what we can see as a legitimate door to the people of that country?
So they have to be very careful because I cannot speak for any of these people. I can just tell you what the things that I've informally observed. Professional diplomats will go to great pains to not give the appearance of endorsing the opposition of any country. Mm-hmm. But you can, in many of these countries, it's hard to realize in the United States, but, the act of attending Mass can be a political statement. The act of having dinner with a priest.
Mm-hmm. And essentially sidestepping the quote-unquote traditional established government. Yeah, no, I can see how that works. And, there's clearly a historical record of great courage amongst a variety of the priests and nuns who have worked in some of the most dangerous environments really on the planet. It's stunning. It's stunning to watch. And at the same time, these folks have to do this sort of political tap dance just merely to survive. I don't know how they do it.
I don't either, because these are folks who find nuance in every single action.
Right.
And that's a degree of sophistication that I, frankly, would like to have but do not.
Well, and that, I guess one of my indictments of the Trump administration is promoting this vision that folks who are truly professionals in statecraft and relationships at that level have been dumbed down to a degree. There's always been a tradition of, the ambassador to Ireland being a campaign contributor.
Right.
We get that. If you're going to Denmark, odds are you're some wealthy high-tech guy from Utah or something who's going to enjoy the skiing. Okay, but on the other token, there's always been the unspoken belief that if you're going to India, Pakistan, if you're going to Central America, you're going to Latin America, certainly if you're going to Eastern Europe, you're a pro. You're supposed to be an adult. And what's stunning is that the President of the United States, regardless of your political affiliation, has done a great deal to disparage the professionalism of those folks and to also disparage and to, quite frankly, chew up, spit out, and throw up in his Wheaties the steps that lead to engagement, that the rest of the world, regardless how some Trump fan in Pennsylvania feels, all right, means something. Constructive engagement, in China was to a certain degree a disaster, but at the same time, folks worked aggressively to keep channels open, free of sort of this day-by-day tilt-a-whirl ride of politics. How important is it to honor that tradition of engagement through nuance, through speech, through sometimes literally a political version of smoke signals? How important is that to the structure of the world politics?
It's critical, and you can see it in Ronan Farrow's book on diplomacy just a few years ago, and you can even see it in General Mattis's comments If you're not going to fund the State Department, you have to buy more bullets. Essentially, diplomacy is your first resort, and deployment of the military is your last resort.
Or it
In
should
an
be.
ideal world,
Right.
that has been the ideal in the past several decades. You know, in general, if you were the U.S. ambassador to France under any administration, you were a donor. You were a very generous donor, and that's true for several high-profile countries. In general, if you were the ambassador to Albania, you were a career diplomat. That was certainly a critical post in and of itself. That's a country trying to get into NATO. So, there's some important work to be done there as well. The interesting thing about Nicaragua, and I'll try to remember to send you some stuff to look over here. But there have been times that the U.S. ambassador to Nicaragua was a political donor instead of a professional diplomat. And essentially the U.S. paid. This happened in the early 70s, where a member of the State Department whose wife was very active in northern Los Angeles, the family had some money. They were able to bundle significant donations to the Nixon administration. This ambassador's previous post was the Bahamas, and he spoke not a word of Spanish, which I would think would be impossible in Southern California, but apparently he achieved that. And became not a word of Spanish and became the U.S. ambassador to Nicaragua. And he was a great friend of the Somoza administration, and the United States was essentially surprised that the Sandinistas were such an effective guerrilla movement because the ambassador had minimized all of that information for several years.
Appointments, elections have consequences, don't they?
They all do.
They all do. The last subject we're going to cover for tonight, and if you're just joining me, Professor Andy Fernandez is joining us from the Western New Mexico University, and on a monthly basis provides us with insight, analysis on issues in the news cycle, or maybe hidden below the news cycle, of what's happening on the border, and how that reflects both in our foreign policy, but it also how it reflects in the culture and also reflects in our economy. It's just wonderful stuff to talk about. Trump's narco-terrorism label. The New York Times is opining that the narco-terrorism label could backfire. How could that backfire? It's what are the implications of these grand announcements when we categorize individuals, groups, cultures?
Well, one of the first would be that it will strengthen asylum applications, because the countries that, when we look at Central America, and it appears that we're beginning to see an uptick in people leaving Mexico for the United States. More people will be able to claim validly. It will strengthen those claims for asylum. They're fleeing terrorists. At the moment, fleeing a death threat by a cartel is not necessarily seen as a valid reason to be granted asylum in the United States. So when you have an administration that lacks a cohesive policy, this is how you get negotiated accords where the Northern Triangle becomes the destination, the forced destination for asylum seekers, but also you inadvertently strengthen the applications of people who are seeking asylum.
Clear us
So
up.
there's a bit of irony there, but I mean it plays out in a lot of other ways too.
Clear up a central concept for us. And I thought about this after you were on a few weeks ago, and I realized that folks need a better grasp on this. I need a better grasp on it. You've got the traditional late night CNN/Fox News videos of folks. Now we're treated to, and I take great humor in this. It's almost like an Olympic sport now. These new barriers that are being erected, how easily and how quickly folks can just scale them, or in some cases saw through them, or it's one of those dark, humorous moments when you realize that the entire electoral effort of the President of the United States was based on building something that was even more flawed structurally than we would have ever believed. But contrast, if you will, from a New Mexican perspective, the folks who are actively walking across and seeking asylum versus the people who are, quote unquote, jumping the fence, to use the term. Are all the folks, quote unquote, jumping the fence going to try and go through the asylum system, or do you still? Or what's the difference between the two? And that's the most asked question I've gotten from people who've listened to us talk.
So the whole point of forcing people to stay in these tent cities in Mexico is to keep them from being able to present themselves to a Border Patrol agent and ask for asylum. Because the United States is legally required to admit that person, to hold the hearing, to do the background check, all of those things. So the whole reason that these folks are being stopped short of the border is to prevent them from being able to legally make that claim. There was one pretty dark episode earlier this fall. We have to remember that the wall is not built right on the border, right? Because we can't have construction crews standing in Mexico building the wall. So there's actually the perceived cession of land by placing the border 15 feet, 20 feet, 100 feet, whatever it is, sometimes a bit further, especially in the case of South Texas. There's a whole neighborhood that's going to end up behind the wall. Near Laredo, there's a golf course behind the wall that'll end up on the wrong side. But there was one particular incident where U.S. Army personnel were arrested at gunpoint by Mexican officials. They were still in U.S. territory, but because they were on the wrong side of the wall, it appeared that they were in Mexican territory. So that took some time to sort out as well. But you may have people who are cutting through or crossing the wall, more likely crossing than cutting. But some of these may seek asylum. Some of these may just want to enter the United States for work. And some of them may be criminals. But that would be a distinctly smaller number. Criminals tend to be involved. The way that drug trafficking organizations seem to work, there are parts of the wall where you can pass things across pretty. It's not that impossible, but when you're talking about cutting holes in the wall, there's a very sophisticated piece of this where there are a few sections where cutters have used a form of putty that is colored to resemble the welds that American engineers put in place to make it look like the wall has been repaired. So that basically just becomes a convenient drop box if it's small, or a convenient crossing point if it's bigger.
All of this would be supremely entertaining if this were a movie with the right characters, sort of a Peter Sellers treatment, or who's the guy who does the Zach Galifianakis in The New Age, all right? But it's real, and it's happening right now as we speak.
It is, and to some degree, this was basically preordained, right? I mean, the Border Patrol, the U.S. government, Homeland Security, they classified all of the strength tests on the fence because, for what should be fairly obvious reasons now, right? $100 mechanical saw can cut through the bollards. But, on top of it, the Border Patrol leadership will still say, this measure being effective was contingent on more personnel. But the Border Patrol is one of the federal agencies that has the biggest problem recruiting personnel right now. That I don't think they have hit their official strength in the 21st century at any point. But tragically, it's also, unless anything's changed perhaps in the last 2 weeks, the agency of the federal government that has the most number of employees subject to disciplinary action or removal.
Wow.
So there was never a condition where the Border Patrol was going to have the staffing to be able to effectively police the fence.
Right. We could do an entire show, and we probably should. Obviously, if even myself, who spent just the barest amount of time in the area, came to understand very quickly I don't want to say the tensions, but clearly, in certain areas, employment in the Border Patrol is lucrative to what the local job market may offer. And the challenges of being part of the Border Patrol, in an area which is so culturally diverse, and I can't even imagine how to approach that issue. And talking to people down there, I just out of respect, that's got to be a real challenge.
It's difficult, and I guess here's maybe one way to make a differentiation. You asked who's climbing and who's cutting and that sort of thing. You can generally tell the difference in the level of desperation that's involved. Somebody who's climbing that is reasonably desperate.
Yeah.
Now, by comparison, in one of last year's Homeland Security reports, it's painful to say this, but the people who are criminals are the ones who are behaving smartly. If you want to get marijuana into the United States, there were 3 occasions in 2017, 2018, according to Homeland Security, where ultralights were flown across the border. And the Border Patrol was not able to pinpoint the flight path of the ultralights or where they landed.
Right.
You're not carrying people seeking asylum in ultralights. You're probably carrying bundles of pot.
Right. And these are not
because if you're carrying fentanyl, you enter through the designated crossing points because that's much easier to smuggle.
And ultimately, the real challenge here is that these cartels, and if in fact your distribution arms are in fact gangs, have been able to amass such wealth that they have the technology. There is enough of an upside for them to invest in significant technology to continue their business. And again, who is funding that technology? American citizens.
We talked about all of these different problems, and I mentioned how resources are allocated a couple of times now, but AMLO is still a very popular president. López Obrador, is still a very popular president in Mexico. And I think one place where he has legitimately made steps towards making an impact is that Mexico recognizes the alarming degree to which weapons are being smuggled from the United States into Mexico. And one thing that may have been in place when you were here, I'm not sure. It's a very recent change, though. The entry into Palomas used to simply be, this metal bar that would be raised when you were waved through, and sometimes the bar would just permanently be in the up position. Well, at checkpoints all along the Mexican border now, they actually have much more sophisticated equipment for checking things like suspicious cavities in vehicles, for being able to search vehicles to see if people are trying to smuggle weapons in.
Right.
What they don't have, though, is a similar problem to what the Border Patrol has. They don't have the staffing all the time. And so this past fall, I've crossed once where people were being subjected to very heightened scrutiny. And I crossed last week over Thanksgiving, and essentially people were waved through. Those are some impressive changes to Mexico's border security, and they have the chance to be very effective. But, Mexico has to have the resources to be able to appropriately staff those. And when they're enforcing our immigration policy, that's money that they're not spending on their own security.
Right. Well, what can I say? At a moment like this, when we always come to a point in the conversation as we're kind of bringing it to a close, you recognize the enormity of the issues. And the enormity of the challenges, sobering to say the least. But I also have to take a moment to wish you, again, first of all, thank you for joining us tonight. Wish you and your
Always
family,
a pleasure.
Wish you and your family the happiest and the merriest of Christmas. Send me some pictures of what it's like to celebrate Christmas in the desert. And again, it's. I think we're going to try and get you on once quickly before the end of the month or right after the new year, and particularly if situations, the news cycle hits again. But if I don't get a chance to have you on the air again before, just again, thank you so much for your contribution this year, and we've got some real great ideas for what we're going to do in the spring, and again, I can't thank you enough. It's just a wonderful conversation, and again, the challenge for all of us is how do we how do we blow the conversation up so it becomes more of a global conversation? And I think that's something you and I are going to work on to tackle for the new year. But again, Merry Christmas to you and your family, and I look forward to working with you in the new year.
Likewise, Pat. It is always. I greatly enjoy being here and being able to reach out, and I'm very much looking forward to being able to continue to do that.
All right, buddy. Well, Professor Andrew Jimenez of the Western New Mexico University. We are going to get a handle on how you can sign up for his class on narcoterrorism. I have never taken a class online. This may be my chance. All I will say is, Professor, is I'm one of those older students. If I can sign up, be kind. All right, I'm one of those people who might need a little extra time on the exam. Be kind. That's all I'm going to ask. Okay.
Be prepared to write.
That's what I'm so good at. Isn't there a course I could take where you just have to be prepared to talk? Well, again, thank you so much. We're running a little bit late tonight. I want to get Connor Dragotis in. He's going to talk about red flag laws, and my apologies to Connor. I'm going to try and get him again before the year. I'm going to reach out to him right now. But again, we are the Coalition, loud and proud, outrage porn-free, civilly disobedient media broadcasting live on the worldwide Coalition Network, reaching tonight to Deming, New Mexico. Facebook.com/The Coalition Radio. On the mighty Twitter at Coalition_radio, and of course the mothership at coalitionradio.us. Stay tuned. We'll have Connor Dragotis with us. We'll be right back, and thanks again. And we are back. We are the Coalition, loud and proud, outrage porn-free, civilly disobedient media. Of course, as always, broadcasting on the worldwide Coalition Media Network here at the Go Local Live Broadcast Center. I've kept him waiting for a while, so I want to get right back to us. Another frequent repeat offender is Connor Dragotis. If you're not familiar with Connor, you should be. He has his own website, ConnorDragotis.com, the easiest website in America to find because there is no one else named Connor Dragotis. But in addition to, as a young man, I have to say that, reaching some of the highest levels academically already, he's teaching courses at I feel one of the great universities in the world, Lehigh University. He's active in corporate communication. He's active as an activist in the libertarian movement, in the liberty movement in general. He writes just, I believe, and this is why I'm so happy that he takes some time to join us. I believe one of the really interesting new lights on the liberty movement. Kind of what do you call it when someone's a five-skill player in football? You're a five-skill player, okay? So let's get right to it. First of all, I have to remark, in the week or two since this has kind of happened, we had a conversation about it quickly online, and the events that happened in New York, and you'll get into it, give us a quick description of it. The fact that they're already off the news cycle, an outrageous case, if you will, and again, part of the question is, what are the facts? An outrageous case of and the poster child potentially for the abuse of the red flag laws took place, and yet seemingly, yikes! At least we're still trying to figure out, who's putting up the bet. Not that did he hang himself, but who's got the best meme for how he hung himself. We're still talking about Jeffrey. Tell us what happened, and how is this already off the radar?
Yeah, it's unfortunately not a great situation no matter what way you look at it. And I guess I should be pretty clear up front that one of the things that I'm not here to do is to offer an opinion about who's right and who's wrong, because like you said, most of the information is muddled, it's unclear. At this point, all that we really know is that there was an individual in upstate New York, about 35 minutes north of New York City, who was involved in a 7-hour standoff with police that may have been an emergency risk protective order or a red flag law. It might have been a domestic dispute, or it might have been a hoax entirely. Regardless, what we saw is two stories unfold. One in which this guy, whose name is Alex Booth, was a hero standing up against the state for his rights, and another where he was a violent domestic abuser who needed to be detained for the safety of his ex-wife and child.
Now, I just want to add, I had Lynn Ulbricht, who is the mother of Ross Ulbricht, on the show last week. And if one wants to, and you cannot, to be responsible, extrapolate one situation to the other. All right? There is no, you can't do that. But if there was ever a case where violent tendencies were portrayed on behalf of someone who was involved in the federal legal system, who then we got the never mind, how many years later, two people come to mind, Ross Ulbricht and, of course, Julian Assange, who all those sex cases, that's the guy's in terrible situation, we don't need to bother. That was bureaucratic. So I have to throw that out there because, it's almost out of a bad spy movie. The plot for years was wrongly convicted, Sly Stallone, but this is really happening. So anyway, back to your point, we don't know, do we?
We really don't. And one of the things that as we got together and started to talk about whether or not this was an issue that you wanted to cover because it was so undecided, what I wanted to point out here to your listeners is the importance of narrative to these kind of situations. I think we can be pretty honest. This is not the last time that we're going to see an individual barricaded in their house against police, right? I mean, we had a situation with a UPS driver today that involved a standoff with police. I mean, this is happening consistently. But regardless of whether or not this particular individual in upstate New York was good or bad or something in between, there is a growing pressure on Americans' right to self-defense. And there's going to be a situation where someone is having their gun rights violated in an unfair manner. What it's going to come down to, though, is how the story gets told. And it's one of the reasons why I have said this before. Communications is one of the most important skills that people who care about liberty can foster and take time to really actually study, is because at the end of the day, those who are looking to take away guns, those who do not respect the right to self-defense of all people, they have an incredible voice in the media. They've been doing this for a long time. It's a fight that they're very familiar with, where people on the liberty side, we aren't as practiced. And especially in a situation like this, it was interesting to see it roll out because what we got from people who care about liberty was a lot of misinformation. And that's something that needs to be fixed if liberty movement is going to be taken seriously when it comes to the Second Amendment moving forward.
Yeah, you take a story, for example, and to your point, there are so many aspects of today's news that point to the Democratic Party's sophisticated ability to shape messages, talking points, to the point where we openly acknowledge the fact that there's some email that goes to everybody every morning, and they're magically on the same talking points. And at the same time, the ability of the Republican Party to just be so terrible at it. Who announces 2 weeks before Christmas that they're going to, for some, let's be blunt here, legitimate reasons, will allow themselves to be portrayed as nuking food stamps? For the love of God, I mean, just as someone who's a practicing politician, I looked at that and I said, let's step away from the facts for a second. What idiot decided on December 7th or 8th to in the beginning of a difficult weather pattern, and at a time when people are still challenged economically, when the mantra of the narrative, if you will, to your point, is wealth disparity, who decided that was a good way to roll out a significant cut in food stamps?
And to their credit, Democrats have handled it perfectly by narrating the facts here, which is, I can't believe Donald Trump is going to take food away from kids over Christmas break. That's just, and it's going to work. It's one of those things. Kids are one of those topics that develops an emotional connection with very good reason. And it was a terrible decision. I'm not sure what they were getting at.
Well, and the only thing missing, I had a bet with one of my friends, was who was going to come out with the first "more? You want more?" meme. That's and then watching the Democratic congressman go into a full Busby Berkeley-like production of "Food, Glorious Food." But back to the central issue here. You've got, for those folks looking for validation, you've got proof positive of the state's intent, and this is what they're seeing with this gentleman's case, proof positive that the state's pure intent is to remove guns from people who are good and deserve them. That the state is inventing a situation where they can go out and begin at least the early stages of gun confiscation. That's what you've got on one hand. And then you've got, on the other hand, this notion that this person was dangerous at home. Critique, if you will, what was clearly the bumbled efforts from the New York State Police and the New York law enforcement authorities. I mean, what happened there? How could you wipe out websites? And this is just, you're taking the heart of the conspiracy. They call themselves now, by the way, conspiracy realists, not conspiracy theorists. You're taking the heart of the conspiracy realists' darkest beliefs and putting them right on front page. How did that happen?
It's an interesting situation, and one of the great things about decentralized media is that you are in a position, like this gentleman was, where you can control your own narrative to a certain extent. This whole situation unfolded because Alex Booth put an Instagram photo up with him saying that he was basically fearing for his life because of the actions of police officers, right? So you're able to create a media cycle out of almost anything. He could have been sitting in his house completely alone and said that, and perhaps many of the same things would have unfolded, maybe not to that degree, but anyone sitting in their house with the right following can cause a ruckus very easily. So what's interesting here is that the media, traditional media, was able to get what they wanted very quickly. Meaning that they were able to get quotes, they were able to run stories that clearly labeled this individual as someone who is a risk to themselves and others, and put their facts in line, get their facts into the media, and then move on to the next topic. Mm-hmm. Unfortunately, what's happened with folks who are on the other side that would seek to view this through the lens of an anti-liberty moment in time, or something, a call to action for people to be more aware and step up and protect their Second Amendment rights, is they threw out unsubstantiated information that became mainstream, that even if a portion of what happened was true, and we don't know what happened, a police department took down their website. There's no public record right now without a Freedom of Information request about whether or not this individual is even still held in New York anymore. We just don't know. But by putting out these points that are so beyond reasonable, by the time you get down to the actual facts, those who care about liberty, those who want to care about the rights of self-defense, they're not speaking from a place of credibility. And yes, in this situation, it might be a short-term damage, but in the long term, credibility is everything. If this had been a situation where perhaps cooler heads had prevailed and a pro-liberty voice was able to get into more mainstream media and actually speak with the local news stations, offer a more informed opinion, I think this story could have had legs a little bit longer than it did. And it could have been started a debate that cared more about, hey, why aren't we caring about the rights of every single person to protect their own lives?
Right. What's it going to take for that to happen, though? Now, I look at someone like yourself, a young leader in the movement. Communications is the focus of your professional life, not just your political one. And you do it at a high level, short of cloning you and a handful of other people, short of, essentially, putting you in a box and driving you around the nation. How do we take that next step? Right now, the liberty movement is characterized largely by a lot of podcasts, some streaming shows, general information shows like this. How do we break through that barrier both it's chicken and egg in a sense. Professionalism will breed acceptance. Acceptance, of course, will breed the financial resources to encourage professionalism. What do we have to do as a movement because it's clear to me that the quote-unquote mainstream media is not really in a rush on a large scale. We're fortunate here in Rhode Island. The news actually comes to libertarians on certain issues, to talk to us. We've got another stadium project going up here in Rhode Island that they want to talk about. And a couple of folks from the media were nice enough to reach out to our organization and give us some airtime on TV. But what do we do? I know I just threw out like an alphabet soup of a situation at you, but I think it accurately reflects what we're facing as a movement right now.
Yeah, I think it could be summarized in one word: education. We're in a very lucky position, and people who care about liberty, we tend to be able to find allies, not on everything, but on specific issues on both the left and the right. Mm-hmm. So if it's the Second Amendment, for example, and you want to learn how to do messaging, you should be reaching out to the Leadership Institute in Washington, D.C., where you can take classes for pennies and get multiple days of live on-camera training, and they'll teach you how to approach these situations. If you're on the left and you're looking at a decriminalization movement, reach out to left-leaning or training organizations and enroll in their free classes. Get a scholarship, travel spend a night in D.C. or in the closest city to you where you can actually go and meet with other people who are doing this successfully, who already have those resources, and then take them, move it back, and apply those lessons every single day. Credibility cannot be overstated. Over the course of time, when we get people who are, stripping on a stage at a convention or anything, that can set people back, right? Because what you want is when a libertarian steps up to a microphone, the first thing that you would hope that would come to someone's mind is, this is a principled person who cares about liberty. And right now, I'm just not sure that that's the case as a blanket statement. Because,
of course, it ties into elections. We have a presidential election coming up. I'll say this, I'll just keep it generic. At the South Carolina debate, some folks did a better job than others. Interestingly enough, it's my conviction that the clear parity candidate can at times be very, very effective at conveying his message. The question, of course, is which libertarians like the message or not. But there's an irony there that the one who's considered a space shot until you actually sit down with him and interview him or put him in a debate situation is sometimes the most on message of all of them. Now, I personally have my beliefs that a couple of candidates did very well, but without naming names, how would you, what kind of, and I don't want to put you on the spot, how do I dance around this?
I might be able to help you out, actually.
Thank you. Go ahead, please.
My focus is not on the presidential election in the Libertarian Party. Mm-hmm. Speaking frankly, I'm not sure that there's anyone up there right now who can make a argument for viability. And in the meantime, that could be $9 million going to train local candidates, in my mind, instead of going towards some national campaign. That's where we're able to make a difference, right? I live in Pennsylvania. We can claim right now that Pennsylvania has more elected libertarians than any other state in the country. We have the county with the most elected libertarians of any county in the country. And one of the ways that has come to be is that there's been a renewed focus on going to trainings and actually going to organizations like Americans for Prosperity, who runs a grassroots leadership academy. And libertarians may or may not agree with a lot of what Americans for Prosperity does, but what an amazing opportunity to spend a total of about 7 full days learning from some of the best in the business. So that is the result that we see at the local level. And it's my hope that even if those folks are on stage and they're putting out amazing content, that the focus will be on local elections where people can make a real human connection. Because I think that's what's going to win in the long run.
Right. The challenge, of course, is ballot access, ballot access, ballot access.
Yep.
Therein lies the exigent threat to the party in general. The fear that we have a sub 1% or sub 2% national election will be spun by people in the duopoly as they'll point that out as testimony to the quote unquote failure of the libertarian movement. Again, you and I, you're right. The correct answer to build the movement long term is to get people elected at the board level, the water board, the school board, the taxa board, you name it. And then, support them to the best you can so that they can dare I say, as libertarians, govern in a way that's reflective of libertarian philosophy, and not be the caricature that some people want to convince in their messaging that we will be. The scare tactics wouldn't be prudent. You're going to give out. I had a gentleman named Anthony Pires, I think it was his name. He was in a debate on a television show, start to talk to me about the libertarian movement being an 18th century agrarian movement. And the trouble is, if you're an establishment figure and you've got quote unquote your establishment, then people go, well, the libertarian movement's an agrarian. I'm not even sure where that came from.
It does a very effective job making libertarians seem outdated. Why would you vote for them? Because they're no longer relevant, right? And it's an effective tool that, unfortunately, both of the major parties use all the time.
Right, absolutely. So, where do we stand now? I've only got a couple minutes left, and with this, what should libertarians take away from this event?
I definitely say take the time to really examine your own credibility and the credibility of the sources that you're looking at. In the long term, if you're trying to convince people of your point of view, you need to be the type of person that people are going to trust. Mm-hmm. That starts today, if not yesterday, right? It's a long-term process to build trust, and it can be lost almost instantly. In our digital world, we're lucky in that there's a lot of content, so past mistakes, put them behind you. They're going to be forgotten in the digital world. That's okay. Focus on doing the right things today, and it'll pay you dividends in the future as you look to spread the message of liberty across your state and across the country.
Outstanding. I think that's the only thing we can do at this point. I think past embarrassments need to become past embarrassments. They'll be resurfaced, but if you if you were a subject to or inclusive of a past embarrassment, you need to take the time to formulate a response and a position.
Yep.
And it could be something as innocuous as when I was young and foolish, and then have a picture handy of one of these lunatics at the Republican conventions, dressed up as a bald eagle with a face of Trump on their rump. That rhymes. You can do that and diffuse the argument, or have an impassioned statement ready as to exactly why you did that and say something reflective. That probably wasn't the best way to do it, to take my clothes off on stage. But at the same time, I've demonstrated, I think as Mr. Weeks, I don't agree with all Mr. Weeks' policies by any sense, but my sense, having met him a couple of times now, is that, and he doesn't need me to put words in his mouth, but my sense is given the opportunity, he wouldn't have done it. And given the opportunity, he'd much rather focus on his sometimes unique perspective of the libertarian movement. But, he has, I think, done the most important thing that anyone could do in a situation like that, which is to not slink away in shame, but to really face the adversity right in the eye and move forward. Clinton taught us that, right? Now, we only got literally 3 minutes. The last time we spoke, I was talking about the inevitability of some senator from Massachusetts. Oh, my God. Okay. I guess my punditry future is pretty much dead. Buttigieg. Beetlejuice. He seems to have survived you talk about crisis management, all these videos resurface. He seems to have survived the great, I actually was friendly to a Tea Party person at a Tea Party rally moment. I'm not sure if you saw that one or are familiar with that one. But, a tape resurfaced of him speaking to a Tea Party. And it's interesting because I listened to most of it, and he never really agreed with them, but there are those who, in his movement, the very notion that he was in the same building with those folks is enough. If you go back to your Maoist Cultural Revolution, send him right to the re-education camp. I mean, people were actually saying he was finished. He's finished. And Kamala Harris, who was at some level still operative, some people, as they like to say, thought she had it all locked up, but it didn't. And now she's gone. So what does this portray in our 2 minutes left for Mr. Buttigieg?
Well, I know you said Buttigieg has survived, but I'm going to argue that he's thrived. Honestly, he continues to take the high road while everyone else is playing in the mud. He's made a strong push toward a religious crowd, which can be important in key states across this country. He's showing strong grassroots support. And like the example you just said, if anything, he's showing that he can cut across party lines. Right now, in my opinion, the biggest obstacle he's going to have is convincing Democrats that he's a good choice at the convention. If he can get past that, I do believe that he'd be a strong contender in a general election. One of the further examples of that, though, that might play in his favor is you may have seen he was recently endorsed by 3 former Obama officials, Reggie Love, Austin Goolsbee, and Linda Douglas, who all came out and said, having worked with the Obama administration, this is our guy, and he's going to be able to take us all the way.
I mean, that's stunning stuff. I mean, he can play the reason. He doesn't wear the military status on his sleeve, but he's not afraid to defend it and actually embrace it. And for everyone who thinks that a mayor of a small, moderate, medium-sized city can't get elected, well, one need only look at William Jefferson Clinton. Who would have thought that a governor of a state like Arkansas could be president? Biden continues to. I mean, I think the official I'm politically obscure, have no relevance whatsoever moment of the week had to be when John Kerry endorsed Joe Biden, and no one cared. What was remarkable is that 8 years ago, that would have been earth-shattering. Absolutely no one cares.
Yep.
You be you, Mr. Kerry, wherever you are, knock yourself out. Who's left that could contend with him?
I think it's going to come down. Again, my opinion here, Biden, Buttigieg, and Warren are going to be chopping it out at the end of the day. It's going to be a matter of who can get the delegates at the convention to make that choice. But I will point out again, I am bullish on Buttigieg, and I have been for a while now. In The Hill, they just put out an article that said the knives come out for Buttigieg, and the entire article only focused on Biden's criticism. And his only criticism was that Buttigieg's health care proposal was too similar to his own. So to say that that's the harshest thing that the Democrats are going to roll out against him at this point as he makes a strong push in early primaries, I think he keeps looking better as the season progresses.
Well, and you know what happens cumulatively on fundraising. The minute you're deemed relevant or non-relevant, it slides downhill very quickly. It's interesting to note that and feel free to debate me on this, the first three most important, if you will, primary/caucuses are not in traditional progressive strongholds, but really represent middle America. Iowa, obviously with his homage to the farmer class, New Hampshire and South Carolina, where, again, to me, his ability to get the warm embrace, well, I should say it this way. If the Bible Belters can find a way to rationalize support for Donald Trump, in the name of God, literally, the Democratic equivalent of same, I've got to believe, can happen in South Carolina. It all comes down to the black vote. And his ability to translate that into results for himself. What helps him is that there's really no one else left who's going to get the warm embrace of the black. I mean, I see Biden, quite frankly, and I'm going to go out on a limb here, and I'll be wrong again in a week or two until we see each other next, but I don't think Biden makes it past. I think it's clear, and I'm not an ageist. Hell, I'm older than you. But it's clear Biden, I don't think has got the staying power.
That's a no malarkey take right there from you. That's that's very true.
I don't think Biden really makes it, because the first sign of electoral weakness, his fundraising is already on very, very shallow ground, and then it just becomes Warren versus Mayor Pete. And a month or two ago, I would have said Warren all the way. I can't say that anymore. So you may very well be right. We will, the next time we get together, we will finally double down and put a bet in place. I'm going to hold you to that, and we'll take it from there. Well,
awesome. Thank you so much.
Well, listen, no, thank you for your patience tonight. You know what programming these things are like. It's a challenge. You get on a roll with someone, you look up and, an hour's gone by. Everyone who comes on this show remarks that, I didn't think I could fill up an hour. You and I could probably go strong for another 2 hours, particularly if root beer or beer was involved. But listen, again, the same sentiment as I had for the good professor. Thank you so much for being part of the show this year. I want to knock heads with you, during or after the Christmas holidays, and come up with ideas that we can take this to the next level in the spring. It's your perspective and your insight into, I think, perhaps sadly, the most ignored part of our movement, if you will, is critical, and I think we just need to do whatever we can to promote your work into being a key ingredient of not just what happens in 2020, but going forward, because that's the only way to success in the future, is to find a way to professionalize our efforts. If we don't professionalize our efforts, 10 years from now, 12 years from now, we'll still be the party of 2 or 3%. People have worked hard to get to even that level. I don't diminish that, but I think we all know we're capable of so much more. So God bless you, lad. All right?
Thanks so much. Have a great night.
All right. We are going to wrap it up there. 5 minutes late, as always. Sorry, guys. We are the Coalition, loud and proud, outrage porn free, civilly disobedient media, broadcasting live here at the Worldwide Coalition News Center. A big thanks to ConnorDragotis.com. Connor Dragotis. A big thanks to the professor. A big thanks to all our guests tonight, the good doctors. We're blessed to have great sponsors: Air Sciences, Yacht Club Soda, Beacon Shipping and Logistics. Listen, they're all up on our website. If you have an opportunity to work with them at any level whatsoever, I would be grateful, because, quite frankly, it takes a lot of stones to sponsor this type of conversations in real time and put your name up there. I am grateful for them, and coming into the new year, we all could work to promote those local business owners, those Liberty businesses that tacitly, quietly, financially support our efforts. You have a lot of places you can spend your Friday night. We're grateful that you did here. We'll be back next week. Stay tuned.